including your initial remarks. It wasn't made on purpose. We just forgot to do that beforehand. Sorry. You will be asked to repeat those at a later date. Right. Okay. Great. So I think we can move on to the actual conference. Is that okay, Elena?
Yeah, I mean, we are very much on time. It's 10:22.
We're very much on time.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can. So I'll stop sharing. The the two land acknowledgements that we have put here for you all to read, and move on to the first of the two sessions. If no one has any objections to that, I hope not. Okay, and I'm going to introduce Ryan Calabretta Sider, who is our first, the chair of our first session. Our first session, which is titled "Captivity and the War." Our participants will be Elena, Giovanni Miglianti, and Brian Thole. Of course, I'll leave to Ryan the duty to introduce them as they will speak. As a general remark, we'll keep all the question and answers at the end of each session. So everybody knows that. Okay, so for Captivity and the War, we have Ryan will both moderate for us. Ryan Calabretta is assistant professor and the section head of Italian at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, where he teaches courses in Italian, film, and gender studies. He has authored several books and co-edited several books, including Divergenze in celluloide, Colore, Migrazione, Identità sessuale nei film gay, The Fairs and Ospetec, and is the editor of Pasolini's Lasting Impression, Death, Eros, and Literary Enterprise in the opus of Pierpaolo Pasolini. He has many research interests, including the integration of gender, class, and migration in both Italian and Italian-American literature and cinema. And he was awarded in 2017 one of the 4 Fulbright Awards for the Foundation of the South to conduct research and teach at the University of Calabria. He is currently the president of the American Association of the Teachers of Italian, president of Kappa Alpha, the Italian National Honor Society, and founding editor of Diasporic Italy, the journal of the Italian American Studies Association. I hope I'm sure I've forgotten everything, most things anyways. So Ryan, I leave the floor to you for the moderation of our first session, Captivity and the War.
Thank you for this lovely invitation. I'm very happy to be collaborating with Elena and Matteo, who are super organized and super professional. Some things I'm not super organized. So our first speaker this morning, however, is Elena Bellina at the University of Rochester. She's an assistant professor of Italian at the Eastman School of Music. Her research and publications focus on war and captivity studies, autobiographical writing, music, and gender studies. She is currently working on Creativity on Stage Behind Barbed Wire, Italian Prisoners of War in Africa, a book manuscript investigating how World War II Italian prisoners in Kenya escaped the trauma of captivity through the performing arts and the sciences. She is also completing African Adventures, Palmiro Forzini in East Africa, 1936 to 46, a critical edition and English translation of a 2-volume unpublished prisoner of war memoir. In 2019, she was the Lauro de Boisi Fellow in the History of Modern Italy at Harvard University. The title of her talk today is in Latin, and I have not been blessed with Latin in my career. Captivus Vulgaris Kenyenes, Italian War Captivity in East Africa, 1940 to 1947. Welcome back, Elena.
Thank you, Ryan, and let me share my PowerPoint presentation. So I will go straight to this one. Okay, thank you everybody, and I'm very pleased to see the great turnout of the conference. So I'll go straight to my presentation, and especially want to spare a few words about this table drawn and printed by Italian prisoners of war who were captured in Africa and spent part of their captivity in Africa and in North America. As they write in the opening statement of this collection of tables that were printed and circulated in the camp and brought back home from some of them, the title of the newsletters was Tra i reticolati, behind barbed wire, and this was a typical title of the newsletters circulating in all the Italian POW camps in allied countries. But here, as you can read, the POWs decided to prepare these tables and distribute them to memorialize the most important moments of their captivity, and of course, capture, as you can read here, in Northern Africa in this case, was the most important event. And here you can read May 1943, Tunisia, on our way to captivity, but it gives you the sense of what the experience was like. And especially with these tables, they wanted to have something to bring home to think about the anguish and the pain experienced in those moments. All the tables are beautiful, but I chose this to visualize how they would be captured, put on these trucks, and sent for thousands of miles down from Tunisia to East Africa, and from there very often put on ships and scattered around 5 different continents. And the other thing I want to start from is the fact that you have to think that in World War II, 1.2 million Italian soldiers were taken prisoners Half of them were in German hands, the other half in Allied hands. But of those captured by the Allies, they were mostly captured by the British forces, around 500,000. And that's exactly the point I want to make with my study on the prisoners in East Africa, and specifically in Kenya. Because in 1940-1941, the colossal British victory over the Italian troops in North and East Africa caught the British forces by surprise. Between June and September of 1940, the British Army captured about 133,000 Italian soldiers in North Africa, while, and I quote, Abyssinia and Italia-Somaliland together yielded another 64,000 captives in early 1941. So a grand total of around 200,000 Italian prisoners in British hands in early 1941. So British and colonial authorities had to build large detention camps with very limited resources in no time. In 4 months between April and July of 1941, Kenya and Sudan built 24 camps, 12 permanent camps and 12 transit camps. But the situation became more critical as per September 1943. As you can see from this table, after the Italian armistice, a total of 500,000 soldiers were taken prisoners by the Allies in the larger Mediterranean region, so all the Mediterranean coast, North Africa, East Africa. And from there, they were sent mostly to East Africa. Most of these men were taken imprisoned until 1946 or early 1947, after many peregrinations across Africa, India, North America, Australia, and Great Britain. They were finally put on ships and repatriated by sea to the ports of Italy. But with this in mind, I mean, let's take, for instance, and here you see more numbers here about the total of the prisoners in Allied hands that got to 560,000 more or less by 1944, and these are the data collected by the Italian War Ministry as the POWs were returning between 1944 and 1947. We will go back to these numbers, but let's take, for instance, Captain Mario Felli, and you can see a picture of himself and his brother Giorgio in one of the Kenyan camps. In his memoir about his captivity in Kenya, titled Come ho visto un angolo d'Africa, How I Saw a Corner of Africa, he closes his memoir with this ironic statement: dopo 7 anni, 9 mesi e qualche giorno, termina il mio safari, in inverted comma, in terra d'Africa, January 1st, 1939, December 11th, 1946. But the important thing is that as Felli summarizes his captivity that he experienced after being sent on a cartographic mission to map the newly conquered Ethiopian territories in 1939, he summarizes his years as a POW and a cooperator of war through this ironic sentence that is accompanied by a long list of all the sites he was relocated to between 1939 and especially between 1941 and 46, and being a cartographer, a beautiful map where he really dotted all the map with all the sites he visited and of course all the routes through which he was taken to this site. You have to think that these prisoners were shifted all over, and so places of the world you would never imagine. But in 1941, Captain Felli became a captivus vulgaris Keniensis. And this Latin term was actually an ironic solution that Felice Benuzzi chose in his diary of captivity in Kenya. Felice Benuzzi became a sensation all over the Allied countries in 1943 for his 2-week escape from POW Camp 354 in Nanyuki, Kenya, to climb Mount Kenya. And this is a picture that he took and included in his war diary. He was a passionate hiker and wanted to reach the peak of Mount Kenya. He was very successful, unlike most British officers running the Nanyuki camp. There was also this kind of rivalry. And after climbing and putting the Italian flag on Point Lenana, one of the peaks, he went back to the camp, and of course he underwent some punishment. But the British officers of that camp wrote that they were really impressed by what he achieved. But this definition was the way, and this is the article, by the way, that circulated all over the Anglophone world in early 1943, the first half of the article, from the East African Standard, the national newspaper of Kenya, to the Times in London a few days later, to all the British newspapers, the North American newspapers, and the Australian newspaper. He became a celebrity. But he coined this definition to describe himself and his peers in the Nanyuki camp. And he wrote, Captivus vulgaris keniensis is not a subspecies of Homo sapiens, but a superspecies. Here one finds concentrated humanity. Every character becomes saturated to an extent that could not occur in free life. Homo sapiens thus appears in its synthesis, Captivus vulgaris. You will find here, as though assembled for a scientific study, every human type. Nowhere else in the many camps born out of the Second World War, you will find, as here in East Africa, so complete an assortment of all ages and trades. Every kind of person is the war prisoner of war camps in East Africa. Old and young, sick and healthy, crazy and sensible, people from every part of Italy and Italian born in every part of the world. So he sums up the entire population, the Italians there who joined the war effort or were sent to war and then had to spend in this limbo a good chunk of their 20s or 30s. But with this definition in mind, Benuzzi was repatriated to Italy in early 1947. He immediately published his war diary as Fuga sul Kenya. The book was immediately translated in English. He actually wrote big chunks of the book in English originally, as it was translated as No Picnic on Mount Kenya in 1952. And in the next 15-20 years, the book was translated into different 50 foreign languages and had 12 different English editions, the most recent in 2015, and it was again a big sellout for this novel. But Benuzzi, Benuzzi, like Feldi, was captured in Addis Abeba and from there transported from one camp to the other down to Nanyuki, to Kenya. And his life demonstrated how he moved from one side to the other, and especially the account in No Picnic on Mount Kenya became a mountaineering and a captivity World War II classic, especially in the Anglophone world more than in Italy. So it really popularized the experience of these POWs. But as he describes his first impression of the Nanyuki camp, and here we go back to the picture, the Nanyuki camp was a vast plain with the corrugated iron roofs of hundreds of barracks. These barracks, made of bamboo covered in tar, ended up accommodating hundreds of thousands and thousands of Italians between 1940 and 1946. As World War II progressed, Italians became an indispensable cheap labor force all over the British Empire, where, and a quote from Bambour and Fedorovich, they were regarded as a pool which Allied governments would continue to draw on in whatever way would best serve the manpower problem and the wider war efforts, end of quote. POWs replaced men at war in road and railroad construction, in agriculture, in all sorts of public and private manufacturing services and activities. And as per 1941, the POWs were utilized to repair the Great North Road, the vital road connecting all the British Central and East African colonies from Johannesburg to Nairobi, from Nairobi to the Cairo. Therefore, when Benito Mussolini was deposed in July 1943, and Italy switched sides with the chaotic armistice of September 1943, Prime Minister Winston Churchill managed to bypass the Geneva Convention. He negotiated a verbal agreement with newly appointed Prime Minister Marshal Pietro Badoglio. Churchill obtained authorization to hold on to the Italian prisoners under the new controversial status of war cooperators. until the crops of 1946 had been harvested over all the British territories. So the 1929 Geneva Convention, and here again, just to remind you of the numbers of the prisoners in Allied hands, the 1929 Geneva Convention made no legal provision for the sudden Italian surrender of 1943, leaving millions of Italian servicemen in the midst of chaos. The Allied countries did not regard the Italian men as allied. On the contrary, they elaborated an articulated system where the Italian military prisoners in their hands could opt to renounce their fascist affiliation and sign a cooperation agreement, thus becoming cooperators of war, or remain faithful to their fascist ideology for different reasons as non-cooperators of war. War cooperators were able to take part in a wider range of work in exchange for very little financial rewards and almost no extra freedom in the new cooperators of wars where they were relocated. Non-cooperators were interned in harsher POW camps in isolated areas in Africa, in the Himalayan region, Australia, and the US. The truth is that whether cooperator or non-cooperators of war, the Italians were kept in camps with almost no freedom and exploited as an inexpensive workforce until the end of 1946. Italy chose to erase this part of its history right after the end of World War II, to avoid facing a humiliating collective experience that posed too many legal and ethical problems. While the nation strove to reconstruct its new political role among Western countries, in its reconstruction as a Western democracy and a NATO member, no room was left for the POWs returning from the Allied, especially for those returning from Africa. Only the stories of their peers in prison on the Eastern European front fitted in the image of the post-war Italy wanted to portray to the rest of the world. But what did it mean for the thousands of Italian POWs kept in Africa who made it back in 1946-47 when Italy was already a democratic republic? Well, from the ethical point of view, I argue that this is a lacuna that pertains the domain of what Susan Rubin Soliman defines crisis of memory because, and I quote, "At issue in a crisis of memory is the question of self-representation. How we view ourselves and how we represent ourselves to others is indissociable from the stories we tell about our past." In the Italian case, I claim we are dealing with a gap operating from a crisis of memory on a macro level. But there is also a crisis of self-representation on a personal level, because the POWs returning from East Africa felt removed from its history and as such did not value their personal war memories and rarely shared them publicly until the late 1980s and 90s and the 2000s, when veteran organizations and places like the National Diary Archive outside of Arezzo started to collect them and value their memories. So what did veterans' life writing teach us about their long captivities in East Africa? Let's go back to Mario Felli's memoir, Come ho visto un angolo d'Africa, and to uncommissioned officer Palmiro Guido Forzini memoir, Avventura Africana. Felli and Forzini donated their diaries to the Diary Archive, and these two diaries, especially the second one because it's particularly long, poignantly summarizes all the captivity experience that all Italian POWs kept in East Africa experienced. They were both kept between the Eldoré and the Bourgoré camps, two of the harshest Italian POW camps built in no time in 1941. They were kept there. They decided to get busy most of the time to avoid the mental annihilation imposed by captivity. And so they were constantly employed, or they constantly volunteered to build barracks and camps, to build theaters, to teach English, Italian, geography classes to their peers, to organize all sorts of musical and theatrical performances that would keep all the prisoners away from depressive thoughts. And here, I apologize for the poor quality of the pictures, but that's what's available through the Diary Archive. The family don't want to share the original pictures. You have a sense of what the space in front of the barracks was like. And the important thing was that all spaces were used for different purposes. They were used for morning inspection, but then became soccer fields for the local tournament on Sundays and Saturdays in particular, Or here you get to see the barracks and the vegetable gardens and different things that the prisoners could do outside of their barracks, and the open space of the kitchen that was important because in the afternoon, these empty sheds were turned into classroom spaces. They would take all these courses offered mostly by the officers, British officers and Italian officers, of course. But here, because they had to take these courses, remember that the prisoners, the Italian prisoner in Allied hands had mandatory English classes. They would receive bi-weekly or monthly exercise books where they had to exercise, do their exercises, but most of them turned these notebooks into their personal war diaries and brought them back with them to Italy. That's why we have this kind of diaries. And this is the reproduction of the first page of the English notebook by Luigi Capecchi, who was interned pretty much in the same camps. But these visually give you the sense they had a pencil, they had a booklet, so they wrote their stories in the making. But it wasn't just writing English or taking these classes, it was also producing a lot of music, art, and all sorts of creative performance. Here, La Canzone del POWiere, or the POW song or the power song, you may notice the word play here, was a popular piece that Mario Felli and Giorgio Felli used to perform on the stage of the Eldoré camp in 1942-43. It was very popular. They go through a very long description of how everybody would join them in singing these lines, how they would dress up, and how they would perform alla Gastone, alla Petrolini, and there's all this repertoire they were familiar with that would reproduce on the stage. But let me read this song because it sums up all the most traumatic events faced by the POWs during World War II: combat, camp imprisonment in foreign countries, food deprivation, disease, the lack of contact with civilians, especially with women, and the resulting endemic malaise. Let me read it. Però si sta male alla guerra, si mangia poco, si dorme per terra. Di donne purtroppo non ce n'è, chi più chi meno si arrangia da sé. Se hai la malaria o il tif, mangi lo stesso il corned beef. Diciamo la verità, certo la guerra, ma si sta. So most Italian POWs in East Africa lived in this limbo from 1941 and 1943. Most of them signed the cooperation agreement in the hope of being repatriated quickly, but that didn't happen. Palmiro Forzini and the Felli brothers rejected fascism, and they were simply moved to new cooperation camps. Mario and Giorgio Felli were moved to Cooperator Camp 351 near Nairobi. These new camps were mostly located outside of the urban centers where they would work for the city. And specifically, the Fellis were working for the British Pay Corps offices. Palmiro Forzini was instead turned into a mechanic and a truck driver for the British forces, and with them toward most of Central, East, and the southern part of the African continent up to South Africa. But theater, musical and opera productions and all sorts of creative activities helped the Italian men to cope with their sense of abandonment. For the Felli brothers, the stage was the only space where they could, with their companions, continue to articulate their frustration and project their fears and dreams, not just about the present moment, but also about the moment of repatriation. And together, they also organized inside the same camp, in the Eldoré camp and later in the cooperator camps, therapy theater through this group called l'Istituto per la Rieducazione dei Ripatriati dell'Africa Orientale, the IRAO. Well, they would imagine all together as theater performances the moment they would be back to Italy. Specifically, they were mostly for Tuscany. They would be back to Florence. They would settle their tents downtown Florence, and there all together they would live exactly the way they were living in East Africa and wait together the moment they felt ready to leave the tents and interact with the civilians. So that's really interesting, in the details they give about these other type of performances. And not just this, because as they went on in the cooperator camps, the Felli brothers in particular kept performing. There is only one picture that Felli inserts at the end of the diary, where it was a costume production. You see Felli, Mario with a dark jacket and his brother with a white jacket. It is clearly a production of something that mixes the local costumes and something more traditional. opera was the biggest genre that all the prisoners cultivated, along with classical music. There are many descriptions of the big productions they organized, but also, and I want to point to this specific orchestra, the Central Italian Orchestra, because the British authorities decided at a certain point that being Italians, mostly creative musicians and singers, so stereotypes helped, they went through the camps in Kenya, they recruited the best professional musicians available, and they created this professional symphonic orchestra, the Central Italian Orchestra. They organized tours for them in all East Africa. This orchestra had a specific camp outside of Nairobi and toured all the theaters of the area. We have programs, we have pictures of Maestro Giuseppe Gagliano, who was a fairly known Italian-Argentinian composer, and I'm coming to an end. But here you get to see that they were not just performing, but also building instruments. What is left and still kept at the archive of the Nairobi Orchestra to this day are these two timpanis that the musician built with bombshells. So when they built the instruments, they performed, they toured this country, and they set the basis for what today is the National Nairobi Orchestra. So they really taught music to the locals and interacted with them. But they went back to Italy very late, and once they landed back to Naples, specifically Mario Felli, they had to face reality, and they had to come to terms with post-war destruction in the Italian peninsula. That was not just the bombed cities or bombed Italy in general, but this extended to Italian institutions. And I'm really coming to a close. The only institutional recognitions that the Fellis got upon their arrivals were 20,000 liras. Besides that, they would not receive much more than occasional undistinguished ceremonies that equally recognize all World War II servicemen independently of the side they took after the 1943 armistice. Not surprisingly, all these POW rarely include in their memoir details about how they dealt with their post-war return and how they managed to pull their lives together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena, so much for that very rich presentation and all those visual images that really brought the presentation, I think, alive. Our next speaker is Giovanni Miglianti, who is a PhD candidate in Italian Studies at Yale University and a visiting student at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. He holds a BA in Humanities from the University of Udine, an MPhil in Comparative Literature from the University of Cambridge, and an MA and an MPhil in Italian Literature from Yale. His doctoral research brings together literary studies, cultural history, and affect theory to analyze the notion of pudore in the works of Primo Levi. The title of his presentation today, Containing Captivity of Bodies, Uniforms, and Writing at Auschwitz. Giovanni?
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you, Elena and Matteo, for continuing this conversation from last month. I'm trying to share my screen. Yeah, I should be able to do that. And I will get started with the presentation. And I hope you can see the presentation in a moment, perhaps. Yeah. So in a 1985 essay, Primo Levi famously defines the human being as a constructor of containers. L'uomo è costruttore di recipienti, una specie che non ne costruisce, per definizione non è umana. My presentation today offers an effective reading of Levi's testimony of his captivity in Auschwitz in light of the notion of containing. The concentration camp itself can be considered as a locus of forced containment, one dominated, according to Levi as well as to several other survivors, by the violation of pudore. In a narrow sense, pudore is an affect that pertains to physical concealment through gestures and clothing, as well as self-protection from an individual's exposure. As we shall see later on, moving from the bodily to the literary level, from the physical experience to its later representation, pudore raises questions of revealing and concealing, of telling and not telling. And these are just a few short examples of a recurring motif in Holocaust testimonies, namely the reference to the loss, the end, and the violation of il senso del pudore. Levi himself reflects on this topic in his Sommersi e Salvati, especially in the chapter Violenza inutile. And I quote, nel ritmo quotidiano del lager, l'offesa al pudore rappresentava, almeno all'inizio, una parte importante della sofferenza globale. offesa is ostensibly Levi's seminal term for the event of the Holocaust. Beyond its juridical resonance, the offesa al pudore, the offense or the affront to decency, is an embodied experience that Levi presents as emblematic of the overall process of humiliation and, ultimately, of human destruction orchestrated by the Nazis, at Auschwitz and beyond. But it says, oh, sorry. L'inutile crudeltà del pudore violato condizionava l'esistenza di tutti i lager. In fact, Violenta Inutile is an essay on the violation of pudore and on the crucial and metonymic relationship between such offesa and the Holocaust. The first two instances of such a violation mentioned by Levi are the public nature of group latrines and chiefly the forced nakedness, la costrizione della nudità. In lager si entrava nudi, anzi più che nudi, privi non solo degli abiti e delle scarpe che venivano confiscati, ma dei capelli e di tutti gli altri peli. La giornata del lager era costellata di innumerevoli spogliazioni vessatorie, per il controllo dei pidocchi, per le perquisizioni degli abiti, per la visita della scabbia, per la lavatura mattutina ed inoltre per le selezioni periodiche. Ora, un uomo nudo e scalzo si sente i nervi e i tendini recisi, è una preda inerme. Together with offesa, a crucial motif of Levi's testimonial works, equally adumbrating the violation of pudore, is spoliazione, or spogliazione, which, as you can see from this quote, is Levi's preferred spelling, innumerevoli spogliazioni vessatorie. The leaflet advertising the publication of Sequestro un Uomo in its first edition in 1947 ties the ethical question that the book raises since its very title to the experience of being stripped naked and morally destroyed at Auschwitz. È ancora un uomo chi di ora in ora, di prova in prova, viene spogliato dell'aspetto fisico e distrutto nella sua esistenza morale. Throughout Sequestro un Uomo, the physical stripping naked and the moral plundering coexist. Levi constantly refers to naked prisoners not only as nudi, but also as esposti all'offesa. The initial spogliazione upon arrival at Auschwitz is the overarching theme of Levi's thought experiment in the chapter sul fondo. Indeed, the verbo spogliare encompasses both meanings of stripping naked and plundering. Likewise, the Italian term spoglia, often used in the plural spoglie, can refer to both the covering or clothing of something, including the corpse, with reference to the Catholic notion of the body as mortal dress for the soul, and to war prey or spoils, with reference to the armor of the defeated warrior becoming a possession of the victor. In Levi's thought experiment, which I'm not going to read in full, the result of the stripping away of a person's loved ones, home, habits, clothes, and belongings is un uomo vuoto, whose own humanity is at risk, poiché accade facilmente a chi ha perso tutto di perdere se stesso. In this passage, the violation of pudore, adumbrated by the specification dimentico di dignità, is linked to a challenge to the very humanity of Auschwitz inmates, to the point that the empty face becomes for Levi the emblem of the sommersi or musulmaner of the camp. Essi popolano la mia memoria della loro presenza senza volto, e se potessi racchiudere in una immagine tutto il male del nostro tempo, sceglierei questa immagine che mi è familiare. Un uomo scarno, dalla fronte china e dalle spalle curve, sul cui volto e nei cui occhi non si possa leggere traccia di pensiero. The personification of what Levi would later define as the Nazi mistica del vuoto in Sequestro un Uomo is Nullakten, whose camp not name derived from the last ciphers of the matriculation number tattooed on his forearm, 018, and marking his dehumanization, becomes an antonomasia for the condition of the Muslim, un qualunque Nullakten, as Levi puts it. Credo che lui stesso abbia dimenticato il suo nome. Certo si comporta come se così fosse. Quando parla, quando guarda, dà l'impressione di essere vuoto interiormente. Nulla più che un involucro, come certe spoglie di insetti che si trovano in riva agli stagni, attaccati con un filo ai sassi e il vento le scuote. Throughout the book, Levi compares the prisoners, including himself, to vermi vuoti di anima, describing the camp as un mondo di morti e di larve, in a powerful and disturbing use from Protheron. Such entomological images, the emptied out sloth and worms on the one hand, the defenseless larvae on the other, may appear diametrically opposed, but they actually point to similar notions of nakedness, exposure, and lack of protection. Pudore's function is twofold, preserving an individual's physical as well as interior privacy. Conversely, Levi presents the offesa in Nazi concentration camps as an attack on both external and internal layers of defense, on both the container and the content of the human. Those among the prisoners who managed to survive need to negotiate their own coping strategies against such an overwhelming exposure. And Levi's 4 examples of vie della salvazione, as he calls them in Se questo è un uomo, include a settler who thinks of himself merely as un sacco che deve essere periodicamente riempito, an engineer who invests his energies and even food in taking care of his uniform so that he would maintain un aspetto rispettabile, a criminal shielded both from the outside and from within by his strength and stupidity, respectively, and a student who closed himself up in himself as if in armor, to the point that his very description is enclosed by 2 references to his corazza. Si è chiuso in sé come in una corazza, chiuso nella sua corazza. Levi constantly reflects upon bodily boundaries, even beyond his works of testimony. And I find it particularly interesting because pudore in itself is a liminal affect that pertains to any relationship between the private and the public, the self and the other. Just to give you one example from Levi's fiction production, the first short story of Vizio di Forma, titled Protezione, presents a world where everybody wears an armor, a corazza, as mandatory protection from the risk of meteorite rain. And some of the effects that Levi describes with melancholic irony, including an overall atmosphere of sadness, as well as positive and negative reactions to such a protective measure, from a vague feeling of security to the loss of physical intimacy with others, are particularly resonant with the 2020 and 2021 reader. But back to Se questo è un uomo, Levi states, la facoltà umana di scavarsi una nicchia, di secernere un guscio, di erigersi intorno una tenue barriera di difesa, anche in circostanze apparentemente disperate, è stupefacente e meriterebbe uno studio approfondito. Concentration camp uniforms can hardly count as protection. Constituted by tattered rags, they function as means of depersonalization and assimilation to the camp system. Rather than protecting, uniforms expose, becoming, together with stripping naked, a stand-in for the overall offesa. For Levi, moral resistance seems slightly more possible when the prisoners are free from the symbolic and physical constraint of the uniform. Thus, paradoxically, it is in moments of promiscuity and lack of clothing, like nighttime, when prisoners had to undress, that Levi manages to carve some privacy and to focus inward, to meditate, as he puts it, so that the life of the mind becomes his tenuous defense strategy, difesa being indeed the opposite of offesa. A crucial chapter in this respect is Le Nostre Notti, where Levi describes the recurring dreams of concentration camp prisoners, and which in the Einaudi edition begins with the quote that we just read. In the 1947 De Silva edition, before the addition of this reflection on bodily boundaries in 1958, the whole chapter is inscribed within a night, between a spogliarci at dusk and a vestirsi at dawn. Somehow then, Levi offers a 5th example of a via della salvazione, one of his own survival strategies. After presenting his dream of returning home and not being listened to, and after realizing that this dream is not just his own, but it is shared by countless fellow inmates, he meditates. Perché questo avviene? Perché il dolore di tutti i giorni si traduce nei nostri sogni così costantemente, nella scena sempre ripetuta della narrazione fatta e non ascoltata? For a moment, his focus is inward. His semi-naked body, undressed as prescribed by the camp night routine, becomes the niche that protects his thinking, mi rannicchio. Despite being a prisoner, exposed to indignities and trapped in an eternal present by physiological needs, in selected moments like this one, Levi manages to draw upon his mind to distance himself from his captivity, prefiguring, even within his own physical vulnerability, a future narration that proves to be a means of resistance and an eventual source of immanent salvation. His testimonial writing will thus appeal to and expand on this meditare. Think of the epigraph of Se questo è un uomo, meditate che questo è stato. Indeed, I believe that a similar paradox, a similar tension between vulnerability and resistance, between exposure and modesty, is at play in Levi's writing. Holocaust testimony requires an effective compromise that after the physical journey of deportation can be considered as a second journey, one that may lead to renewed humiliation and whose object of representation includes the stripping away of the human condition, but also one that, precisely through the conscious account of such an exposure, allows for a reaction to the violation of pudore. Levi himself presents a German translation of Sequestro un Uomo as a response to the immodest violence of the concentrationary experience. While the Nazis stripped people naked, his testimony will provide them with a new literary dress, according to his often repeated goal to rivestire, to clothe people in words, something that by his own definition vuol dire farne un involucro di carta pesta, di pelle. In a recent article, Mario Barenghi has discussed Levi's poetic writing as rivestire, taking inspiration from the final lines of the poem Meleagrina, where the lyric I compares himself to a pearl oyster. Ti rassomiglio più che tu non creda, condannata a secernere, lacrime, sperma, madreperla e perla. Come te, se una scheggia mi ferisce il mantello, giorno su giorno la rivesto in silenzio. And I quote from Barenghi, come te, l'analogia è ellittica, ma il senso è chiaro. Anche l'umano, il poeta, non fa altro che rivestire la propria interiorità di parole per poterne curare le ferite. Unquote. I think that this applies more generally, not just to Levi's poetry and to his self-representation, but also to Levi's testimony, which is often biographical in nature and which draws consistently upon pudore-inflected figures of speech such as avoidance language, understatement, and irony when clothing real-life people and facts with words. I maintain that pudore, what prompts Levi's rivestire, should be considered as a driving force and a structuring principle of Levi's authorial practice throughout his production, testimonial and other. Moving beyond testimony for a moment, it is interesting to notice how Levi's explanation of rivestire un uomo di parole in a 1986 interview with students, farne un involucro di carta, di pelle, echoes his definition of paint making in La chiave a stella. Fare vernice è un mestiere strano, in sostanza. Vuol dire fabbricare delle pellicole, cioè delle pelli artificiali. In the same book, the Levi-like narrator goes on to compare the technical action of cucire insieme lunghe molecole with its literary counterpart of cucire insieme parole e idee, confirming that the notion of rivestire draws upon both the word of paint chemistry, fabbricare delle pellicole, cioè delle pelli artificiali, and the semantic field of clothing, cucire insieme parole e idee. In conclusion, despite his strong and often asserted belief in clarity, Levi's writerly practice is significantly informed by and filtered through the lens of pudore, as I hope to show in my doctoral dissertation. In the case of testimony, Levi's writerly practice enacts both the literal experiencing of pudore and violated pudore within the diegesis of Levi's account, and the characteristic reserve or modesty that critics have often ascribed to him, but less often described or characterized. What I mean by effective compromise is that a Holocaust survivor who chooses testimony over silence, like Levi, partially waives his own sense of pudore when putting into words what he endured and witnessed during captivity in Auschwitz, to the point that he will write in a letter to a young reader that scrivere è denudarsi. At the same time, however, it is through the mode of testimonial representation, through his rivestire di parole, that Levi manages to forge a literary container that may partially restore the modesty and human decency so brutally denied in the concentration camp. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni, for that really interesting talk. I'm sure we'll have some questions for you at the end. The last speaker today is Brian Thal. Brian received his PhD in Italian from Rutgers University, where he wrote a dissertation on representations of confino, or internal exile within fascist Italy. His research interests include anti-fascism, prison literature, biopolitics, Italian film, and dystopia. He recently published an article entitled Italy Must Be Defended, Surveillance and Biopolitics in Una Giornata Particolare, in the edited volume, The Cinema of Ettore Scola. And his article titled Il mondo è meglio non vederlo che vederlo, Naples as Urban Dystopia in un paio di occhiali, is forthcoming in The City and Civilization, Representations of Urban Spaces in Italian Culture. He is currently an instructor of Italian at Duke University. Today he's going to talk to us about Kairos and Confino, mythologizing the resistance. Brian?
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Matteo, I'm not sure if I have, could you make me a co-host? I know there are two Brian Tholes on here, so I'm the one without the icon. There we go, next to my screen.
Good.
Okay. So just give me 1 second here. Perfect. All right, thank you, Ryan, for the introduction, and it's good to see you again. And yeah, thank you, Elena and Matteo, for organizing this conference. I'm very excited to be participating in this conference on captivity. In some ways, captivity in Italy is the story of a nation. For example, in post-unification Italy, the practice of domicilio coatto, an early type of administrative deportation, was applied to those deemed to be dangerous to society, such as idlers, vagabonds, those suspected of working with the brigands, camorristi, in general suspicious peoples. Introduced to the Legge Pica, the practice aimed to strike down any opposition to the newly formed liberal Italy and to shape and control individuals who exhibited behaviors that the government deemed to be deviant. It was, in short, an exercise in nation building and an experiment in making Italians. Liberal Italy's policy of domicilio coatto paved the road for future fascist violence through the institution of confino, or forced peripheral exile of individuals under Mussolini's fascist regime. Indeed, many of the penal colonies that existed under domicilio coatto would continue to be utilized under the fascist confino. Confino recounts the story of a nation, as well as many of the individuals sentenced to confino would go on to shape the politics of Italy and Europe, as well as the literary community in Italy. So today my paper focuses on the representation of confino in Wu Mingwen's most recent novel. Here we are, La Macchina del Vento, which narrates the story of Erminio, a young socialist exiled on the island of Ventotene. The title is obviously a play on H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, La Macchina del Tempo, and in my analysis of the novel, I will unpack the complicated relationship between mythology, resistance, and temporality. I argue that through mythological, fantastical, and science fiction elements, the novel seals the Italian resistance within its own mythos, one that started first and foremost in confino. So in the novel, Greek mythology plays a very important role, with various gods siding with the fascists and others with the anti-fascists. Erminio, before his arrest and subsequent sentence to confino, studied literature in Bologna and was preparing to write his thesis on the Italian archipelagos in Greek mythology. Throughout the novel, we are immersed in what seems to be, at times, Erminio's imagination regarding the presence of Greek gods on the island of Ventotene, while at other times it seems as if Wu Mingwen actually wants to suggest that they have a physical, non-imagined presence on the island and a presence in the battle between fascism and anti-fascism. We learn, for example, that Poseidon, dio dell'olio di ricino, da tempo combatte col regime, sides squarely with the fascists. There are others as well, Cercian, torturatore per conto della polizia politica, the one-eyed giant Polyphemus, fascista ante marcia, who lost his eye in a battle with the Arditi del Popolo, the giant Antaeus, caporeione della milizia. In the novel, then, the struggle against fascism is painted as a colossal task, but not one that is impossible to overcome. For example, the Arditi del Popolo, a historical militant anti-fascist group, fight against Polyphemus and cause him to lose an eye, suggesting that the giant of fascism could be defeated, while also ascribing a mythical significance to resistance in confino. During another episode, Giacomo, who is another confinato on the island, loses his balance and runs into one of the fascist guards, who proceeds to push him away, sparking a series of events in which envelopes and paperwork are scattered across the room and ink spills on the guards. This angers the guards, who are about to punish Giacomo, before Sandro Pertini intervenes, putting himself between Neri Chiaramantesi, one of the most hated fascist guards on the island, alongside his brother Gabriello and the confinati. Anti-fascists of all tendencies rally behind Pertini in order to protect Giacomo. And I quote, "Al fianco di Pertini, oltre a me, che gli ero rimasto accanto, si schierò Domaschi con le sue mani di fabbro. Poi si disposero i capi comunisti, Secchia, Scocimarro, il siciliano Licausi e anche i Terracini e i gelisti. Tra quando Fancello di Don Roberto. C'era anche Spinelli col suo fisico temibile. C'era Ravaioli pronto ad usare la zanetta. Tra gli anarchici c'erano magnifici volti da pendagli da forca. Tra i manciuriani c'erano autentici pendagli da forca. C'erano sloveni, croati, albanesi e c'era Mengistu. C'eravamo tutti. Per la prima volta un fronte unico. So in this quoted passage, we witness for the first time in the novel the Confinati coming together as a single unit in the struggle against fascism. Up until this point, the reader may only understand the Confinati as a homogenous group and their shared persecution under the regime. Indeed, Booming One strives to exhibit the differences among the Confinati in calling attention to the various political factions and their respective mainstay and the disagreements that arise with regard to their different political ideologies. In the quoted passage, then, it is just as important to name those same political ideologies and factions one by one in order to assert the momentous camaraderie and unity of the action. In reminiscing on this moment, Erminio directly ties the event to the future downfall of Italy's fascist regime. Quote, "Quando ci ripenso mi gonfiò ancora d'orgoglio, l'orgoglio di essere stato compagno di lotta di quell'uomo, di tutti quegli uomini, e non posso non collegare quella mattina di fine giugno del 40 al 26 luglio di 3 anni più tardi." The episode then also takes on a mythological importance when we later learn that the Chiaramontesi brothers are actually the Elodi, Otis, and Ephialtes, two giants in Greek mythology. Much like the struggle against Polyphemus mentioned at the beginning of the novel, this encounter underlines the gargantuan task of defeating fascism while also sealing the Italian resistance in its own mythos. Indeed, in this scene, Booming One names his own giants of anti-fascism, the figureheads of each political group. Booming One then locates the origin myth of the Italian resistance, not during the period of the Nazi occupation in Italy, but rather in Confino itself. Booming One furthermore provides origin stories for artifacts created in Confino, such as the Vassoio di Ventotene, which Ernesto Rossi created it in Confino to give to his nephew as a wedding gift. In the novel, Rossi shows Erminio the vase that he has completed, and Erminio notes the figure of Aeolus at the center of the painting. You can see here, who sends a gust of wind toward Poseidon, knocking the crown off his head. So if in Booming One's book, Poseidon fights alongside the fascists, then Rossi's depiction of Aeolus, who knocks off Poseidon's crown, represents the eventual unseating of fascist power in Italy. In the novel, resistance is also closely related to various concepts of time, which sort of add a science fiction element to the novel. So time plays an important role, from the concept of the time machine to the clock in the piazza that never functions correctly. For Erminio, the clock is a symbol of his condition in Confino. Forse che il confino non marcia a un tempo tutto suo. The clock then represents the way in which Confino is grounded in a space that exists out of time. Erminio continues, "E ogni tanto penso che se fossi un confinato a riparare l'orologio, se fossi proprio io a ripararlo alla buon'ora, sarebbe come il messaggio inviato al nostro futuro." Erminio's statement underscores the important role that the Confinati will play in Italy's future. If the inaccuracy of the clock demonstrates the way in which the space of Confino existed outside of time and therefore independent from history, it is with the intervention of the Confinati, with their own resistance, that the course of history is destined to change. This concept is most clearly expressed by another Confinato on the island, Guido Ravaioli, in a section which, as Booming One suggests, is one of the key passages in the novel. Quote, "Che il duce verrà giù lo pensiamo tutti, ormai la questione è quando. Non c'è mica da rallegrarsi, intendiamoci, che le idiozie di quella patacca non le pagherà solo il regime, le pagherà l'Italia e noi erediteremo le macerie. Però noi vediamo l'occasione di ricostruire. Invece là la maggior parte della gente è ancora sonnecchia, intorpidita dal fascismo. Qui vediamo il futuro, mentre nel resto d'Italia non ne hanno la minima idea. Pensateci, la vera macchina del tempo è quest'isola, questa comunità di reetti. Datemi retta, la macchina del tempo siamo noi. Contrary then to other stories of Confino that paint the space in which these individuals are exiled as a space that is stuck in time, so we could think of Cristo si è fermato a Eboli, for example, Wu Mingwan asserts that it is instead a space occupied by those who have broken the chains of time and are working to construct a future beyond fascism. And so he plays with this idea of the construction of a future Italy, both through the organizing in which the Confinati participate, as well as through the idea of the Confinati to construct an actual time machine and travel to a future where fascism no longer exists in Italy. This is, of course, a fantastical goal and one that adds to the science, that adds to the mythical frame of the novel, a science fiction element, but it also serves to demonstrate that the Confinati are builders, the main architects of an inherently anti-fascist and an inherently anti-fascist Italy and Europe. We'll also come to understand, as the goddess Athena explains in the novel, that, quote, Pandatteria, which is the Latin name for Ventotene, Pandatteria ha uno scorrere del tempo tutto suo per un'antica svista di Cronos. However, rather than Cronos, time with regard to its quantitative nature, La Macchina del Vento comments on the importance of Kairos, that is, time with regard to its qualitative nature. In ancient Greek, Kairos referred to, quote, the right point of time, the proper time or season of action, the exact or critical time. Thus, imprisonment in Confino presents itself as a moment of Kairos, a crucial moment in which the Confinati would begin to construct the future of an anti-fascist Italy and European continent. As Ernesto Rossi states in the novel, quote, bisogna essere su un'isola come questa, in un momento come questo, durante una guerra come questa. The Kairos of anti-fascism then relies not only on the exigencies of a specific time, but also those of a specific place. But Wu Mingwan also uses the concept of the time machine to allude to the international struggle against fascism. When the Confinati are discussing the possibility of traveling to the future to a time after the fall of fascism, someone also mentions the possibility of traveling to the past in order to kill Mussolini. This leads one of the Confinati to question how that can be possible. Quote, scusate, ma se andiamo nel passato e lo ammazziamo, allora lo abbiamo ammazzato. Ma se lo abbiamo ammazzato, perché oggi ce l'abbiamo ancora tra i coglioni? The Confinato speaking here touches on a logical paradox of time travel. That is, traveling to the past to change to the future would eliminate that very same need to travel to the past. But another Confinato responds, quote, perché se andiamo ad ammazzarlo nel 16, creiamo un altro corso degli eventi, diverso da quello che noi abbiamo visto. This comment about parallel universes leads one Confinato to exclaim, proletari di tutti gli universi paralleli, unitevi. The expression used by the Confinati in the novel should not be understood, of course, as a literal rallying cry for the inhabitants of all parallel universes. Instead, it is an obvious nod to the famous expression in Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, workers of the world unite. Here then, in connecting the two expressions, Wu Mingwan is underlining the importance of the international struggle against fascism, a concept that many Confinati would come to understand well. It is not enough to oppose Mussolini and the fascist regime within Italy. Effective resistance to fascism presupposes international solidarity and action. But in the novel, even language is connected to time, mainly through the linguaggio notturno, a certain language only spoken at night, and one that is opposed to the linguaggio diurno, a sort of realistic language. For Erminio, the linguaggio notturno, despite being opposed to the realistic language of the day, quote, non aveva cornici, passava di visione in visione, generava paradossi, apriva scenari, descriveva gli effetti di incursioni in altre epoche. The linguaggio notturno, then, is one that defies reality. It is a language that serves to meditate on possibilities, even those that are utopian in nature, rather than realities. Wu Mingwang himself refers to the linguaggio notturno in an interview with Jacobin Italia as, quote, quello delle visioni compensatorie, delle fantasticherie che aiutano a resistere. Fantasticherie sempre legate al proiettarsi in avanti, al superare le pastoie del presente. Di queste fantasie, Erminio arriva a comprendere l'importanza, il valore, la pulsione utopica. To imagine the end of fascism is for the Confinati to imagine a utopia. Indeed, the beginning of the narrative takes place in 1939, 17 years after the beginning of the fascist era in Italy, with no end in sight. So to carry out a revolution, to flip the normal order of things is, in Michael Hart's words, to instigate utopia every day. To conclude, La Macchina del Vento stands in opposition to some contemporary assertions, such as that of Berlusconi, that Mussolini simply sent his political opponents on vacation. Instead, the Confinati transformed the immobile space of exile into a productive space in creative, intellectual, and political terms. Many of the Confinati would go on to fight in the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War, and then go on to fight in the resistance in Italy itself. Following this, many had careers in the post-war literary and political community as well. Thus, Wu Mingwang's novel provides a sort of anti-fascist counter-mythology to fascism's own mythology rooted in the myth of Rome and Romanità. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Well, this never happens at an Italian conference. Everyone pretty much stuck to time, and we started early, so we have a lot of time for questions. Thank you to all the panelists. Very interesting papers that intersect at different moments, ironically.
I have a question for Elena. It won't spark much discussion. I'm just very curious. Are there, in addition to these memoirs, are there also like fictionalized accounts of experiences in POW camps?
Well, Felice Benuzzi's book was immediately translated, was immediately turned into movies. Even recently, there was a big CBS talk show in 1956 featuring Felice Benuzzi. So yes, that specific novel, diary, because it's really a war diary, yes, was fictionalized in many different ways with some adjustments based on the cinematic or TV show adaptation. But that was the one that was turned into many different things. Yes, about the others' diaries being private memories or memoirs or diaries donated in recent times, not that I know of. Some descendants have been publishing recently a fictional version of their relatives' diaries, and I'm thinking of Paolo Mastrolilli, who wrote a beautiful novel, Adelphi, putting next to each other his father's war diary from Yol. Yol was the harshest camp for non-cooperators of war on the Himalayan region, and his uncle's experience as someone who instead who switched side after 1943 and worked for the Navy services against Mussolini's navy. That's a very interesting novel. So that's another fictionalized or collection of the two versions. It's not about East Africa, but that's the most recent I can think of.
Sure. Great, thanks.
I have a theoretical question for everyone, and maybe this will be an interesting way to start the conversation. So obviously we're studying from trauma theory, and a lot of trauma theory in Italian studies goes back to Primo Levi, right, and the Holocaust writers and memoir. How do we see, and I don't know if I dare use the word intersection, but because of the intersectionality, but how do we see the intersection of trauma theory and affect theory, as Brian mentioned in his paper? Is there an intersection? Are they completely separate? And then is there a way to look at either or both of these theories from an actual intersectionality perspective?
Well, I'll go first, but I mean, all of the memoirs or diaries are analyzed are all based on personal impression and feelings and moments in the lives of these men in that given time, in that specific place. So yes, of course, that plays a big role in this kind of analysis. I think you have to start from that assumption, but it's the way when you take into account the subject described in the voice, where it's coming from. Of course, you have to historicize the moment and the production and the experience, but also empathize. It's normal to empathize with them, and of course you can relate to them when you're in special times, the way, for instance, we are living in right now. But yes, it plays a big role, affection theories and all of that, and even in the in the images produced by this man, or at least the prisoners I work with, or about them. It's all this idea, and of course, the way they wanted to play with their feelings, or use them, or represent them, or the way they wanted to represent themselves and talk about what they lived through.
And then you get into masculinity studies.
Oh yes.
The sectionality of gender and race, not being a land.
And language and race and sexuality and masculinity. I mean, the big thing in these camps was that prisoners, for instance, in my case, were allowed to marry, and there were weddings celebrating. I didn't bring that part into this presentation, but they were allowed to marry, to live together in barracks. They would wear rings. They would behave. Certain men were regarded and called with their feminine names, with their female names in the camp, and all of that. That was a huge thing there. It's in remote areas outside of time and space. As Brian said, time becomes this mythological entity that is there and is no longer there. You don't know what you are doing in history and why you are in East Africa. But Brian and Giovanni, thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, so I wanted to piggyback off of just one thing you just mentioned about masculinity, because I'm thinking about writing on Confino, and most of it is life writing, is memoirs. This is a fictionalized account, of course, from Wu Ming. There's also a graphic novel that was written in the at the beginning of the century, as if it was a long time ago, but in the early 2000s. And then, of course, Una giornata particolare, even though that's not, doesn't take place within Confino itself. It is, I would argue, a Confino film. But anyway, in a lot of these, masculinity plays a pretty big role, I'd say, more than even like trauma theory, especially in the memoirs. So rather than depicting their experience in Confino as a sort of traumatic event, it's very much follows the superhero genre, and they are the superheroes of the story, who even in one of the stories, who they escape from the island, blood running down their face. And so it's really interesting to look at that. But also just reminds me at the same time, gay men were sent to exile were sent to Confino as well. So masculinity comes into play there as well. And of course, even if we think about the film Una giornata particolare, there's a lot to say about that too. But yeah.
And if I can just pick up on the idea of gender, I think, yes, of course, the violation of pudore is very much a gender-laden trauma, and you might have seen that many of the quotes that I shared on one of the first slides were actually taken from women survivors' accounts. And that was actually my entry point into the subject. I first worked on pudore in the writings of female Holocaust survivors. But then I just found that, and of course there are gender-specific experiences of women within the concentration camps. Men and women were actually divided, and women had their set of experiences which they often recount. But I thought that this notion was worth exploring also in the experience and in the writing of a male survivor like Levi, particularly because it kind of carves a sort of like nuance or new space in that binary between shame and guilt that is often associated with Holocaust testimony, and that too goes back to Primo Levi. Of course, a lot of shame theory about the Holocaust draws upon his chapter on Vergogna in Sommersi Salvati. But it seemed to me that this affect that here I analyzed in relation with the testimony is actually very interesting to explore also throughout his production. And notions of gender play into that very interestingly. In La Chiave Stella, Levi draws a comparison between Tiresias, the great ancient Greek prophet that changes sex, experience of both sex, to the experience of the survivor who comes back to tell his story, and in a sense, it's a sort of like transition himself. So yes, I think that gender plays a very crucial role, not just in the Holocaust production, but throughout. And it is interesting to see how the Holocaust production remains very tied to a sort of like binary understanding of gender, whereas, for example, in his short stories, Levi experimented a lot with notions of gender, attributing gender to cars, with he cars and she cars, playing with centaurs and their sexual copulation, and in many unexpected ways. But yeah, this kind of goes beyond the scope of this panel.
Other questions for our panelists?
Could I jump in there and ask a question? And thank you for 3 absolutely fascinating papers. I have 2 questions in a sense. One is for Elena and for Brian, because there's a presence in your papers, of course, of the rewritings that women have done of both of those, like I'm thinking of Point Lenana on one hand, and on the other hand, of course, Brian was talking about La Macchina del Vento. So I'm thinking of the way in which within Italy itself, the uses of history in this context, so it goes back to the question about the fictionalization, I suppose, of these episodes, but I'm really thinking about it from the angle of the uses of history. The other one is for all 3 of you, and starts from the question of pudore, which Giovanni very beautifully discusses, very interestingly and movingly discusses from the point of view of the narratives. But I keep thinking about the question of pudore from the point of view of the reader, the viewer. It's partly, I suppose, also because of work that I've done on travel, and that connects to tourism, and we have the whole area of dark tourism at present that is growing. But it's sort of that sense of the pudore from us accessing memories that I would like you perhaps to say something about, and how this comes up in your work, in the works you were thinking about. Thank you.
I can start with the problem of history. Of course, the whole field I analyze is a brand new field. Captivity studies in Italy started in the 1990s and became huge in the last 10 years, not that much, of war captivity, World War II captivity. But the point of how Italy retells this story and manipulates the story through the decades from the 1950s up to the present time is part of all this discourse, and the way and the moment these diaries, memoirs, or collection of pictures or collection of drawings have become available. Of course, it happened between the late 1990s and nowadays, and very randomly. For instance, the collection of tables that I was able to buy on eBay from a book antiquario, so through book collectors. Well, I saw them, I contacted him, and I asked about them, of course, but I asked, where do they come from? May I have some more information? And he told me he couldn't share many details, but there are lots of grandchildren of gerarchi fascisti who came back from these camps, who are now selling for financial reason I ricordi di guerra del nonno, or the grandparents' memorabilia from the war and from captivity. And you have no idea about how much of this material is becoming available right now through these channels. And of course, because now we can talk about them. Needless to mention the fact that if you want to access the UN war trials and you are in Italian, you have no access to this day because I have to run a background check. And of course, if you are just an Italian citizen, the answer is always no. Needless to say that. So this sense that history is still in the making, even if it's World War II history, because there are many personal family feuds still running and going on. Well, it's real to the present day. And of course, the official narration and shaping of history was done on purpose. And in my case, these prisoners were really not mentioned at all to this day. I doubt history books for high school in Italy mention the Italian POWs coming back from Africa, or what they did. By the way, I didn't mention the whole fact that many of these POWs in East Africa or South Africa, and I mention in Africa because it's the place that has been the least case study, the least captivity studied to this day. Some young historians have done beautiful work about the POW shipped to the UK. Of course, the North American case was the easy case, especially for the Hereford camp, and the camps in South Africa as underwater, of course, was very much inquired, but and Yol, or the Indian camps, and now someone is starting a new research project on the POW in Australia. But the fact is that for the African camps, there are very few records available, all in the UK National Archives. At the Archivio Centrale dello Stato, everything was destroyed and sent to the Macero in the 80s and 90s. I've been there. And then, so you have to retell the story, but many of these men, and I come to my point, became very important, not just musicians and artists who wrote a lot, who produced a lot of things there, but also some of these prisoners in the camps that you saw in my maps were hired by the Likis for the most important archaeological and paleontographical discoveries. Lucy's, our ancestors, were discovered in the areas in the Rift Valley in Kenya next to those camps. The Kilis contacted the scientists intern in those camps and involve them in their archaeological sites. And some of them wrote very important scientific essays or went back to direct the National Science Museum of Kenya in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. There's all this history we know very little about. And I'm coming across this as I go on and on in reading these diaries and seeing the accounts, usually personal accounts, even from the aristocratic English women left in their farms, in their possessions in East Africa, who would hire for free these POWs to help her and work for her in those farms. So yes, there is history to be rewritten to this day, that has been rewritten many times in the Italian case.
Just a note before anybody else to say, yeah, I've had that experience as well, and also, you know, buying things on the Bancarella in Trastevere, and it's very ambiguous also. So there are questions here, as you're pointing to, which are about the way in which, for instance, the family archives also are constructed and how that is changing. But also there's the ambiguity of that memory. I've had, you know, looking for colonial stuff, and then you get sort of accosted by whoever runs the Bancarella saying, well, if you are un'amatrice della materia, we've got other stuff. And you just think, you know, what's going on? I've been there. Thank you.
Brian or Giovanni, do you want to jump in? Brian, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, just I guess, yeah, I'll continue sort of what Elena was talking about, rewriting and history. So there was, of course, a post-war boom of memoirs in Italy, and Confino memoirs were also a part of that. But I think, beyond that, at least in my experience, when I've spoken to people about Confino, even Italians have a very vague notion of Confino, have maybe heard of it. Of course, heard Berlusconi's famous quote, but I think the retelling of these stories really help to bring back that history and to clarify it, or even bring new accounts that had never been previously told. So I guess I'm thinking in the context of La Macchina del Vento, there are of course some like real it's not totally fictionalized. There are some real events in the story, and one like really interesting clarification that they brought into the story, which I thought was particularly fun, was with the Manifesto di Ventotene. So the Manifesto di Ventotene is, you know, known today as one of the founding documents of the European Union, and it was, of course, written on the island of Ventotene during Confino. But what very few people know is that the document itself was like really hated at the time that it came out. People did not actually adhere to it. It circulated in very tight circles on the island of Ventotene itself, among the Federalisti, they're called, and the Giallisti, so those from Giustizia e Libertà. But even then, there was a lot of criticism of it. So we have this idea of, and then it disappeared after after the war for a while and didn't pop up again until later. And so we have this idea of this grandiose document that that was one of the founding ideas of the European Union, but it wasn't without its problems and criticisms at the time. And so it's really interesting to find that in the novel. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about another novel, a graphic novel, In Italia sono tutti maschi, and this one is about gay men who were sent to Confino, and that is so important because we just don't have testimony from gay men who were sent to Confino, because it was seen at the time as something to be seen at the time as shameful, and it brought shame to the family, and so no one wanted to talk about it then or after the war, of course. And even after the war, they weren't entitled to any sort of compensation, the gay confinati, even though they were classified themselves as political prisoners. So, in creating a graphic novel like In Italia sono tutti maschi, it's a way to tell those stories for the first time, and a way for the public to know about these stories. We're getting to a point where those in Confino are, if they haven't already told their story, they're never going to be able to tell it, right? Where Confino started in 1926, so we're almost 100 years from the beginning of Confino. So I'll leave it to Giovanni.
Yeah, I'll just answer to the last question. Thank you for the question about the reception, pudor in the reception on the part of us accessing. I think that is very much true both at the individual level. I'm thinking about both general readers, but also scholars and researchers who access texts that were meant of a private nature. There's, of course, the whole story behind Anne Frank's diary and its censorship, for example, but also thinking of images and Holocaust-related imagery. I happened to work at the Wiener Library a few years ago in London, which is a large repository of Holocaust testimony. And there were a lot of debates among the staff members of whether or not they should follow the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's lead of going social and exploring all possibilities that social media platforms offer, including, for example, a Pinterest board where very private documents could be posted for everybody to see and put on their own boards together with pictures of cakes or clothes or whatever, with very little context provided next to it. But yeah, also
there was an infamous episode about selfies being taken in Auschwitz, if you remember, which again raises serious issue.
A lot of them, because some of these selfies were also encouraged, for example, by official campaigns of the Israeli government, encouraging people to to post their own experiences or to post the tattoos of their grandparents and to expose, in a sense, this sort of like living memory of the Holocaust. So yeah, I think that's the whole topic about the pudor or lack of pudor in the reception of Holocaust related imagery is extremely fascinating. In terms of Italian Holocaust literature, I think there's also a cultural level or a collective level of pudor in the reception. And I'm thinking about what Brian was saying. Yes, in the immediate post-war years, there was a boom of memoirs, but that didn't last. Like there was also a pause to that, and that was because of, we could say euphemistically, a sort of like generalized pudore in the reception of Holocaust testimony. So a difficulty on the part of the Italian public to receive narratives that were not narratives of agency like the ones of the resistance, but they were, in a sense, the stories of a defeat, if one sees it in that sort of like binary terms. And there are some episodes,
and
for
in
example.
those years, especially, of course, I don't need to teach you. You know, in Italy, il comune senso del pudore meant something else as well.
And that was actually also like weaponized on the legal level, also towards people who were producing the first documentation about the Holocaust. And I'm thinking of Meneghello under a pseudonym on Comunità. The Olivetti journal publishes some pictures of the Holocaust in Poland with naked Polish women led to their death, and there are threats of denuncia per oltraggio al pudore by readers that feel outraged by the idea that such pictures could be you know, brought to the readership. At the same time, there were threats of similar denuncia by visitors. Generally, they were like policemen visiting the Mostra della Deportazione that toured Italy from the 1960s and throughout the 1970s. And some people were very offended by the fact that these exhibitions portrayed explicit nakedness. So yes, I think it's a fascinating theme, that the old reception theme, and like the pudor and the reception, it can take a lot of different directions. As yeah, I tried to cover. Thank you for the question.
And Alessandra, if you had a question, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much for these very fascinating papers. I have actually a question that is the kind of effect of your 3 papers put together, rather than asking you a single questions, which I also have, but given that the theme of the conference is captivity, I was thinking and rethinking your presentation through this lens. And one of the things that I think is striking is the fact that there is a very different kind of confinement in what you are presenting, and in the way victims of confinement re-elaborate the confinements, give us a sensation of the kind of confinements. Like, for example, Elena and Brian, there is a kind of space of freedom in that kind of confinement that is a very kind of dialectical kind of component between the fact that you are in a confino or in a concentration camp, but at the same time you find a kind of a space that otherwise you wouldn't have in the society. Like Brian, you were mentioning the fact that basically the confino it's a perspective on something that from inside fascists you cannot even see. And Elena, you were mentioning pretty much the kind of same thing, the fact that, for example, in terms of gay marriage within the concentration camp, it's something that it's otherwise not possible. But in Giovanni, there is not this space, of course. It's a completely different kind of experience. And it seems that the confino coincides almost with the body of the Primo Levi, and the fact that to write about it, it's to rivestire, ricucire. It's really something that has to do with the body itself. So my question is, what role plays identity in this kind of experience of captivity? Because in Elena, the identity, the national identity, being Italian, plays a very important role in your paper, and there is a kind of re-elaboration. There is a kind of nostalgia when they go back of the confino, which is maybe a nostalgia of being Italian in a certain way also. So in Brian Yor, there is a political kind of identity that's very, very, very strong. And that's why the utopia, they can build a future from, from that perspective that otherwise is not possible within Italy in that moment. Giovanni, identity and I want to ask you about it. What play, it seems like the humiliation in the pudore, it's very strong, to be completely exposed. But it's also the effect of, how can I say, it's not just a confinement, that is a really high level of discrimination. Like the target of that kind of confinement is very connected to the religious identity. in the case of Primo Levi, of course. So it's almost that the kind of reason why they're there is because of their singularity more than like a collective identity. What is destroyed, it's really like the humanity. So how does Primo Levi negotiate his identity in his text? And basically that's the question for everybody. Thank you so much.
Who wants to go first? Should I go first, or Brian or Giovanni? Do you want to go first?
Go ahead, Elena. You're already unmuted.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this question, Alessandra. In my specific case, there are two historical elements that you have to take into account. Well, the armistice of 1943 for these men meant nothing. They were in the Horn of Africa with no direct contact with the nation, with the motherland. They've been there in most cases since the late 1930s. They had no idea about what was really going on in Europe, in Italy. Most of them didn't even believe that fascism was no longer a thing. And of course, I had to make important choices. And most of them went with becoming a cooperator of war, for obvious reasons, but many of them, especially the officers who had been trained as officers, wanted to stay faithful to their training. They were afraid of the repercussions on their families in Italy. They had no contact with them for a decade at that point. So all of these came together, but they were identifying themselves as Italians, and especially as Italian born and raised under fascism. That's the point. I mean, they were brainwashed, and of course they knew nothing else besides that. And under this kind of captivity, especially in British hands, they were also regarded with a series of stereotypes, the Italian to the British, where in a certain way, they had lots of even medical definitions. The Italians suffered of Latin hysteria. All Italian men are Latin at large, creative musicians, performers, unruly, weak, and all of that, but very creative. So they decided, medically speaking, to encourage their artistic side. Or they were cooking, they were making pasta. You can imagine all the stereotypes that they applied to the Italians, and therefore they felt categorized also like that in that specific captivity outside of time in remote regions in Africa, in contact with the local populations who were guarding them and British officers. But having said that, there's also the idea that in that space, they find new resources. Many of them experiment for the first time their artistic sides. They create artistic group. I always mention this case for the Italians in the room, the Casa dei, the ballroom kings of Italy on the Costa Romagnola, in Italy, La Musica del Liscio. I mean, they started in those camps in Kenya, the Casa dei brothers. I also found that in their memoir. So there's an entire lab that those camps become for these Italians who have a certain perceptions of themselves there before and after 1943. And of course, what they are seen as, or what they feel like they are once they make it back to Italy. So there are all these different perceptions, but you're right that very often they perceive themselves as groups. Even in their veteran groups, when they started sharing, collecting these memories, because for those who made it back, very often they made it back with their writings or the writings of friends who didn't make it. Very often that was also a typical case. And they had seen a huge continent for 10 years. They learned the local languages. They mixed it, they spoke a different Italian influenced by the different regional words, and very often among these people, there were Italians like the maestro of the Italian Central Orchestra, who was born in Italy, migrated as a kid to Argentina, went back to Italy, joined the fascist army and all of that. So there was this wide Italian universe as per Italy in the 1920s and 30s. Sorry, and I'll stop here. Sorry if I spoke too much. Brian and Giovanni. Thank you, Alessandra.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Alessandra, you mentioned that, of course, we're talking about different kinds of confinement here in each of our papers. And yeah, that's definitely true. In Confino, there is a bit of liberty although some have called it an open air prison, but we cannot obviously deny the fact that there's more liberty in confino than there would be in the confined space of a traditional cell, or of course in a concentration camp. Having said this, there were, curfews, other sorts of rules. They couldn't join public gatherings. There was strict surveillance, especially for the political prisoners. But when I think of confinement and the reason for confinement in Italy, the reason for confino, I think of it in terms of productivity and in terms of intellectual and political productivity. And it was sort of the regime's attempt to halt this kind of productivity. And we could just think of the famous quote that is said to have been uttered by the prosecutor at Gramsci's trial, which was, "We have to stop this brain from working for 20 years." And so confinement then becomes a way to stop this sort of political organizing, this anti-fascist political organizing, which completely fails, obviously, in confino. You see in all the memoirs and all the stories that they continued their political work in confino. And of course, if you send all the political prisoners to one place and you send the most well-known communists and socialists to one place, I think they're going to find a way to organize. But having said that, their political identity was also, highly factional. And so you have your group of giallisti, you have the comunisti, socialisti, and then even within those groups, you have factions. As usual, there's no shortage of infighting on the left. So, for example, Umberto Terracini was expelled from the Communist Party while in confino for opposing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But one thing that does tie them all together is just sort of this idea of confino as a scuola di antifascismo. And this is a term that Alberto Giacometti uses in his memoir Ventotene. And it's kind of hard not to see it in that way when you do see how many confinati then once they were, they studied in confino, they read a lot, they had classes in confino, and so it's sort of hard to see it as something other than a scuola di antifascismo, especially following that study. Many went on to put that study to the practice and participated in the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War, and went on then to to be leaders even in the resistance after 1943, and of course, as I mentioned in my paper too, become politicians in post-war Italy. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Alessandra, for this question. I when thinking about the Holocaust experience, and I'm really looking at its literary representation by Levi, and thinking about this notion of rivestire un uomo di parole, I'm thinking about one special kind of parola, which is the name, which is generally seen as a placeholder for identity. And I think that the naming practices in Levi are very interesting, because after all, his works of testimony, much more than autobiographical, are biographical. There's critics who have borrowed the concept of prosopography from Dante to talk about questo uomo as a sort of like collection of portraits of different kind of people, being them real people or types for kind of inmates that Levi met during his time in Auschwitz. And what goes on there is very interesting in terms of the negotiation with the sense of pudore, because on the one hand, Levi often renames them, especially those we defines as not man anymore, not human anymore. He often renames them, and in a sense is probably protecting their privacy, but at the same time he's exposing their story and turning his story into something typological in a certain way. And he did face a number of reactions from some of these transpositions of real life people's stories into the literary character story. Mostly negative reactions by people who didn't recognize themselves in how he described them. But what I think is interesting is that he didn't apply this sort of like naming technique to the prisoners themselves. He also applied it to the perpetrators. So for example, there's a Nazi or a German chemist that he meets in the laboratory, and that he, after Auschwitz, meets again thanks to a common correspondent. And throughout their correspondence, it seems to be pretty inclined in understanding is this former perpetrator, in a sense, this former chemist whose name is Ferdinand Mayer. And then when he describes this story in the chapter Vanadio in Sistema Periodico, and he renames him Lothar Müller, he has a much firmer stance on this character, and he writes in his correspondence that this is because up until this person was alive, he felt bound to him as from a sort of like sense of human restraint, or the common restraint that is necessary to use towards another fellow human being. But after his death, he thought that it would be much more interesting than just retelling their own story to kind of turn him into a sort of like universal character and a representative for a whole generation of German people who acted in a certain way. And so I think, yes, I think that in that respect, that the identity is not just Levi's identity, but it's also the identity of all the people that he transforms through the literary lens.
Okay, well, thank you to our three panelists. I think we're exactly at time. So I think that means it's lunch or coffee break or something fun. So I will turn it back over to Elena Matteo. Thank you all for that rigorous discussion.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and to all the panelists. It was an amazing discussion, actually, right on time. So it was perfect. There's nothing more to say about this. I think it's time for everyone to refill their coffees, and I think we'll start again in about half an hour. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, it's 12:45, but yeah, we will start connecting.
12:45. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, we'll gather together at 12:30ish, and then we'll start at 12:45. I'm going to suspend the recording for now. We'll start again later. Okay. Thank you. So you can relax.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ryan. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, and welcome back to the second panel of our conference, Captivity and Social Justice in Modern Italian Culture. We are now reconvening after this intense morning for the second panel, Reforming Captivity in Italy. So we're getting straight to the point of prisons in Italy. And our panel moderator today will be Maria Bonaria Urban. She's an assistant professor in Italian language and culture in the Italian department at the University of Amsterdam. She's a member of the Amsterdam School for Regional, Transnational and European Studies and of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. At the moment, she's the director of historical studies at the Royal Dutch Institute in Rome, and she's currently in Rome, we just heard. Her main current research and teaching interests are in the cultural history of the 20th and 21st centuries, with a strong focus on the construction and mediation of history and national discourse, with a transnational, transmedia and interdisciplinary focus. She is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Italian Cinema and Media Studies and book review co-editor of Annali di Italianistica. Please join me in welcoming Maria Urban, who will go on with our panel speakers. Thank you. Maria Bonaria.
Thank you, first of all, Matteo and Elena, for inviting me to moderate this session, which you promised to be as inspiring as the previous one. So thank you again. And welcome also to the speakers we are going to hear from now. I will briefly introduce each speaker, and after the three papers, we will open a discussions. So let's start immediately with the first speaker of the session is Dr. Matteo Brera, a very well-known among us, I would say, Matteo. Matteo Brera is a postdoctoral fellow at York University, where he directs the digitization of the Angelo Principe collection of historical Italian-Canadian newspapers. And his research focuses on transnational exchanges between Italy and the Americas, Italian and European literatures, fascist and ecclesiastical and political policies of censorship. Also a criminologist,
Matteo specializes in Tennessee legislative history, imprisonment for profit, and the sociology of crime, with a specific focus on the fictionalization of imprisonment and practices of degradation in post-World War II Italian films. And today, Matteo is going to talk on Puramente Casuale, Italian prison films, and the 1975 carceral reform. Please, Matteo, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Maria. Let me just share my PowerPoint presentation, which starts from the last slide, as you see. Okay, I have a couple of clips, so hopefully everything will go according to plans and you'll manage to hear everything. But let's get in medias res with the paper now. With this slide, media discourse and representation of crime influence mainstream culture to the point of claiming their own place beside scholarly approaches to crime as form of popular criminology, able not only to study crime films, say Garland and Sparks in criminology and social theory, but also, I add, to render a picture of the society whom they're screened for. In this respect, prison films are not only capable of shaping popular culture, but are themselves a receptacle of the sociological signs that the directors perceive in their current political discourse on crime. In this paper, I aim to focus on the Italian case to demonstrate the cinematic representations of incarceration, whether of dramatic or comic register, written in a specific historical context, mirror the ongoing penal debates and propose themselves as a critique of the social, penal, and carceral systems. My analysis will focus on two films produced and screened before 1975, when the Italian legislature reformed the Italian prison system. L'istruttoria chiusa dimentichi by Damiano Damiani, 1971, and The Farfallon by Riccardo Pazzaglia, 1974. Do not expect a semiotic analysis of the film, of course. I'm going to work on these from a cultural history perspective. First, I will contextualize the production of the selected movies within the penal transformations brought to the Italian criminal justice system by the carceral reform of 1975, and I will thus analyze the films as mirrors of the political and cultural discourses on imprisonment, crime control, and rehabilitation that heavily impacted Italian society during the Anni di Piombo. Let's start with a bit of, well, kind of legal or legalistic background to say that before the 26th of July, 1975, when the law 354, the rules on penitentiary system and the enforcement of measures to deprive and restrict freedom was passed by the Italian parliament. I will not have time to go through the long, very long parliamentary debate, which is probably going to be published at some point. By then, I was saying the fascist penal rules of 1931 were still fully in force. The principles that informed Mussolini's carceral system and which were designed by the Ministry of Justice, Alfredo Rocco, were essentially the deprivation of liberty and physical pain as instruments to re-educate and rehabilitate the convicts. Prisons were conceived as impenetrable and isolated institutions to be completely detached from the rest of society. A vertical and centralized bureaucratic apparatus to which personnel was rigidly subordinated exercised daily acts of violence on inmates and violated the most elementary rules in terms of respect of human dignity. Political initiatives to change such a flawed system had failed before 1969, when riots occurred in several facilities across the Italian peninsula. The authorities' inability to control the revolts and media coverage of the events heavily influenced the political and cultural climate of the time, and a series of attempts were made to sensitize public opinion on the chronic overcrowding of Italian penitentiaries and the appalling welfare conditions of inmates. The spirit of the 1975 reform was the enactment of Article 27 of the 1948 Italian Constitution that embraces the humanization of punishment. According to the third comma, punishment must not consist of practices that contravene the shared sense of community and must aim to rehabilitate the offender. The new legislation, at least on paper, provided a long-waited for constitutional enactment that has been subsequently modified in 1986 and was to be further improved by the Riforma Orlando of 2017. But we all know that that reform died before being born. Overall, the legislators' intention was to attempt to challenge Goffman's concept of the prison as a total institution and offer a public image of the penitentiary as one of the many social formations that include those citizens who, although caught violating the criminal code, should not feel permanently excluded from the social fabric of our country. These are the words of Senator Mario Zagari in his address to the Justice Committee of the Italian Senate of the 7th of November, 1973. This ideological approach, promoted by the Ministry of Justice, led to the inclusion in the bill in preparation of certain aspects, particular aspects, such as the probation under the supervision of a social worker, work releases, the permessi premio, and the release on temporary license, the semi-libertà. But also, one of the most significant aims of the bill was to, of course, reduce chronic overcrowding, but also to open the penitentiary to the external world, thus allowing professional figures such as criminologists, social workers, and psychologists to interact with the institution and inmates. And of course, the overarching aim was to transform or start a transformation of a purely retributive system into a rehabilitative one. There was something missing in the new legislation, in particular when it came to the role of correctional officers. This is probably the main flaw of the law, as no real provisions were made to change the controversial figure of the agente di custodia, a military corps established back in 1890, and then modified a couple of times, as you see from the slide, in 1907 with the royal decree, and then again in 1937 when Mussolini's power was pretty much at its apex. So you can imagine what kind of repressive ideology was behind this. The Corpo degli Agenti di Custodia was only demilitarized in 1990, and it became the Corpo di Polizia Penitenziaria, which is what it is today. And the 1975 reform is however rightly seen as a step forward in modernizing the Italian criminal procedure and carceral institution, and it also contributed to bring the Italian carceral system closer to its European and international counterparts. Unfortunately, as I said, there were these pitfalls here and there. During the parliamentary debate, intellectuals, including writers and directors, accompanied the long road to the approval of the new legislation, and intervened in the debate, denouncing the obsolete conditions of the Italian criminal justice system, and in particular, the prisons. One of the two films I'm going to talk about today is by Damiano Damiani, and is L'istruttoria chiusa dimentichi. Damiani, you probably know, that is also the director of the famous Italian television series La Piovra, a description of contemporary Italian mafia and its infiltration within the political system. And he was inspired for L'istruttoria chiusa by the book Tante Sbarre by Lero Spittoni. And this little known novel hints at the many obstacles of social and psychological nature encountered by an engineer during his short spell in prison due to a miscarriage of justice. Accused of an alleged culpable hit-and-run homicide, young and bright engineer Vanzi is incarcerated awaiting trial. Life in prison, the presence of violent inmates, the unreasonable inflexibility of rules, and the repressive methods of the guards soon become unbearable to him. And the violence and the rotten institution, as they say in the film, of preventative imprisonment and political corruption underlying the whole system are the three main points discussed and raised by the film. He is a victim of the liberal institution of preventative detention, awaiting a trial that, due to the lengthiness of the Italian penal system, is going to take quite some time. Vanzi is labeled by a fellow inmate as the living proof of the absurdity of the juridical system. For a while, the protagonist manages to use his financial resources to corrupt. What did I do? There's something wrong with this. I'm just trying to figure out what's happening here. Okay. I was saying, for a while, the protagonist manages to use his financial resources to corrupt officers and even the prison doctor, thus obtaining to be relocated to a better cell thanks to the intervention of Rosa, a mafia associate who is in custody on behalf of an influent personality whose identity, I'm sorry, but I don't know what's happening with the slides, whose identity is still mysterious. Vanzi's new cellmate is Pesenti, a key witness in a trial against political echelons who tried to cover up the failure of a dam that killed over 1,000 people. Pesenti is wanted dead by the political and mafioso set up, and Vanzi becomes unwillingly a part of a scheme to kill the incorruptible Pesenti. 5 inmates attack Pesenti and kill him at night in his and Vanzi's cell, simulating a suicide. Vanzi witnesses the murder but is blackmailed by a prison officer and forced to lie to the prosecutor who is investigating the case. Vanzi, now a part of the corrupt carceral world, realizes that he must obey to be set free and testifies accordingly. He's immediately released and shaking his hand, the warden congratulates him and patronizingly asks him to forget what was only an unfortunate adventure. Damiani's film has a robust sense of popular spectacle and links heavily his character's vicissitudes with Italian contemporary and historical political controversies, thus situating itself in a strongly militant position. For example, the trial in which Pesenti is a key witness reminds very closely the Vaillant Dam's failure scandal of 1963, that constitutes in popular imagery a direct link between politics and corruption at the expenses of citizens. Of course, in the film, there's an incredible attention to the ambience of the prison, the oppressive ambience of the prison, and the particular focus is on the riots which had marred the whole system until at least 1969. I wanted to show you one first clip, and this is part of the official trailer, so you can have a look at what I mean. Okay, so you see the the general really oppressive atmosphere of the film and the attention to the riots. But the film describes prisons and as antiquated and still profoundly fascistized institutions where psychiatric visits are used to incapacitate rebellious inmates, and asylums are the ultimate punishment should solitary confinement not be successful in disciplining riotous individuals. Damiani denounces without compromise the urgent necessity of carceral reforms, and in doing so, it presents the prison as a microcosm of free Italy, a country ruled by discriminations, kept alive by the obsessive presence of organized crime. During a strong sequence, the strong sequence of the riot, which you've seen here just for a short while, the inmates welcomed the public speech of the chief of the guards, who is called hierarchically il superiore, the superior, shouting duce, duce. This goes beyond the mere satirical invective, of course, and identifies the authoritarianism of the prison system, which was designed by Mussolini as a reincarnation of fascism. Popular culture and denunciation of a dysfunctional prison system emerged vigorously also in a totally different Italian filmic genre. It was 1974 when actor Franco Franchi and Ciccio Ingrassia impersonated goofy caricatures of Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman in Farfallon. The two convicts in Riccardo Pazzaglia's film, one a Sicilian pastry chef whose name is Farfallon, whose obsession is to kill his unfaithful wife, the other a slimy and treacherous nobleman who has been jailed for bribery, go through a series of surreal escapades and are transferred from prison to prison in consequence of the oddest series of events. Unlike the original American production directed by Martin J. Schaffner, Papillon, they find themselves in a carcere permissivo, in a permissive prison, in which inmates are fingerprinted using Swiss chocolate so that they can find pleasure in licking their fingers afterwards, and receive artistic mugshots dressed up as pilots or Venetian gondoliers. In this truly peculiar institution, corporal punishments have never been used. However, shackle beds are still eerily stored in the cellar. And in the words of the female warden, another peculiar thing for penitentiaries of the time, the Italian carceral system, so familiar with Farfallon, is made of, and I'm quoting, prisons where convicts are kept in a state of perennial subjection and violence that prevents any proper rehabilitation. She goes on stating that her institution embodies instead the motto of the Italian carceral law, namely vigilando redimere, rehabilitate through vigilance. Farfallon admits that it thought the actual official motto had previously read on prison's door was in fact vigilando deridere, rehabilitate through derision. And the fortunes for Farfallon and his associates change for the worse when, after yet another unsuccessful attempt to escape, they are finally shipped to the Colonia Penale Agricola, penal agricultural colony that not only is a parody of Devil's Island, but is also a strong attack to fascist conventions, the Confino, and principles still informing the Italian prison system in 1974. The director of the work camp is a stereotypical figure, half fascist guard, half plantation owner, who is carried around in a litter by convict slave and is a death penalty ancien regime enthusiast, although he cannot help underlining with a touch of irony how the rules to be followed strictly by inmates were introduced back in 1891. Contrary to the warden of the permissive institution, it prohibits any reference be made to rehabilitation and reintegration in the community. He even bemoans the illegality of capital punishment. However, it takes pride in asserting that the guillotine standing out in the center of the courtyard will cut off unlikely rioters' masculinity if needed. And on this, I will show you Mario Carotenuto in this clip.
Io dico subito che mi attengo rigorosamente al regolamento generale degli stabilimenti di pena del 1891. Avete preso il vostro bagno di mare, avete indossato la gloriosa uniforme carceraria col numero sul camiciotto e nelle ore di riposo vi metteremo anche la palla al piede. Silenzio assoluto! Rispetto riverente per i superiori e sorveglianti, niente lettere, niente colloqui, tranne che con gli avvocati, ma proprio una volta ogni morte di sua santità, il Papa. Qui nessuno deve parlare di recupero del reo, di altre stronzate del genere. Questa ghigliottina non è qui per tagliarvi la testa, perché purtroppo la pena di morte momentaneamente è stata abolita. Non può tagliarvi un bene più prezioso della testa. Io questo discorso lo faccio a chi ha intenzione di evadere. E che ne ripeto? Guarda un po' che gli succede.
Now, the reference to deprivation of masculinity also suggests a rather blunt deconstruction of the over-coded image of the male hero, which is described and studied by Sparks in a beautiful article of 1996 in favor of a de-heroization of characters, which is common in parodic films such as Farfallon. In addition, the mockery of the structural limits of the prison system wittingly focuses on peculiar forms of mass incarceration. One, the permissive model, ridiculously utopian; the other, the colony, surreally close to the Italian reality of the 70s. Before moving on and concluding, I just want to say that on this note, Farfallon and the Baron also experienced solitary confinement for 8 long years in a cella di rigore inside the penal colony. Here, the flaws of the Italian penal system are listed in full by another inmate, and I have another very short clip to show you here.
Sono io, Farfallon. Senti, non per sapere i fatti tuoi, ma tu perché ti trovi in cella di rigore? Perché ho chiesto riforma del codice e miglioramento del regime di vita carcerario, la riforma dell'ordinamento penitenziario e abolizione del regolamento Rocco. No al carcere preventivo, no alla lentezza della procedura giudiziaria, no ai continui trasferimenti, fine dello sfruttamento del lavoro carcerario e della stipulazione sul vitto e attuazione della legge previdenziale carceraria. Solo questo hai chiesto. Per adesso questo. E quando esce da qua dentro?
Right. Okay, so the brief analysis of the selected films intentionally taken from the two opposite poles of the genre spectrum allow for some general and preliminary conclusions on the utility of prison films for the policy-making process in the Italian socio-political context before the carceral reform of 1975. Although very different in many respects and characterized by their own aesthetic patterns, both L'istruttoria chiusa and Farfallon are all but locked in old formulas, as many prison films screened before and after them. Their authenticity does not rest, for instance, in claims of depicting fictionalized accounts of an actual event. Both directors assert, as usual in their films, that they are giving or have given a completely fictional description of facts and people, and that any reference to real events is puramente casuale, purely fortuitous. However, even under the satirical and apparently superficial layer of Farfallon, references to precise historical routing of very much present pitfalls of the Italian penal system are clearly exposed. And among them, there's the appalling conditions of the prisons, the inadequacy of a purely retributive system, the connivance of the state and the legislator to cover up violence and degrading practices within penitentiaries. Compared to more famous blockbusters movie on imprisonment of the 90s, such as The Shawshank Redemption, in which a cathartic ending reassures the public of the successful actions of the hero, the evil nature of wardens and guards, and the triumphant role of justice, the Italian prison films of the 70s tried to isolate and highlight the main defects of the prison system, albeit with the limits of dramatization and semantic transformations imposed by the cinematic medium. Instead of flatly representing the carceral industrial complex and propose a generic imposition of the meaning of prisons, these films played a part in informing the public of what needed changed in Italy and its prisons in the crucial years that led to their partial but still significant reform. And with this, I concluded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matteo, for this inspiring paper. I'm sure we will have time to ask you some questions later on. But first of all, we move on to the second speaker, Dr. Monica Jansen. Monica Jansen is Assistant Professor of Italian Literature in the Department of Languages, Literature and Communication and Italian Language and Culture at Utrecht University. Her research interests include modernism and postmodernism studies, and more specifically, new forms of cultural engagement. She investigates cultural representations of socially relevant topics such as religion, precarity, youth, migration, from an interdisciplinary, transmedial, and transnational perspective. She is co-editor-in-chief of Annali d'Italianistica and a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Italian Cinema and Media Studies. And today, Monica's paper is Votare il mare col secchiello, Adriano Sofri's writing on captivities in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Please, Monica, the floor is yours. Unmute yourself, yes, please.
Thank you, Maria Bonari, and thank you, Matteo and Elena, for organizing this wonderful follow-up of the MLA session. So, I will talk about Adriano Sofri's writings on captivity in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Prison director Luigi Pagano once said that to clear the San Vittore prison is like emptying the sea with a bucket, and he attached the sign "full" on the prison gate to underline his statement. The problem of prison overcrowding is one of the recurrent themes in Sofri's critical prison writings and lies at the origin of the related topics of life imprisonment, amnesty and pardon, sexuality, re-education, immigration, suicide, illness and drugs, which he elaborates in various media as a journalist and as a writer during and after his own life as a prisoner. Adriano Sofri was convicted in 1990 for the murder of police officer Luigi Calabresi on 17 May 1972 and sentenced to serve 22 years in the prison of Pisa. The unresolved emergency of overcrowded prisons in Italy recently became world news with the corona outbreak, which sparked riots, prison riots in early March 2020 all over the country. According to the end of the year assessment by the political and cultural NGO Antigone, the turmoil was triggered by the prisoners' anxiety generated by the impact of the pandemic, which, according to the measures taken by the Italian government, required distancing, which is impossible in an overcrowded cell, and the suspension of all face-to-face meetings between convicts and their families. At the time of the corona outbreak, Italian prisons counted more than 61,000 detainees and space suited for only 50,000 people. The official rate of overcrowding was superior to 120%. In order to meet this problem, during the first wave, 8,000 units were allowed to complete their terms in house detention. But during the second wave, the number of detainees rose again, together with the number of infections, and stabilized at 55,000 at the end of November 2020. Adriano Sofri, in his rubric Piccola Posta on il Foglio, started commenting on the events, pointing out on 10 March that the COVID pandemic had been the spark that inflamed the Caporetto of Italy's agonizing penitentiaries administration. He also remarked on March 11 on the indifference of the media regarding the high number of deaths caused by these revolts. At that time, 12 in the prisons of Modena and Rieti, a number of casualties which he interpreted dramatically as the avant-garde mentality of sacrificing the human singularity to the indifferent heap of the mass grave. On April 8, he wrote a furious column in which he attacked a number of state representatives and journalists for their misreadings of the impact of the coronavirus in prison and of the serious motives underlying these prison riots. And finally, on February 17, Sofri commented on Marta Katarbia's nomination as the new Minister of Justice, hoping her curriculum could guarantee a fair juridical system without revenge. A selection of his Corona Chronicles has been translated into German and published as a book. Starting from these public interventions in times of the new cholera, in Sofri's words, it is possible to address Sofri's prison writing as a way of continuously reworking, re-elaborating and recontextualizing his own prison experience chronicled in Le prigioni degli altri of 1993, Piccola Posta 1999, and Chi è il mio prossimo 2007, which are the three works I will focus on in this paper. In these autobiographical collections, composed of diary notes, letters, columns, and essays, he continuously combines his close observations of prison's daily routine, made of micro-events, with his distant engagement with epochal changes on a global scale, such as his ecologist concern for the extinction of animals and plants and for the extinction of younger next generations due to the lowering birth rates, at least in Italy. This freedom of a floating mind within the prison walls, which Sciascia attributed to Gramsci when he called him the freest man next to Benedetto Croce in fascist Italy, as Sofri remarks in one of his most recent posts, could be attributed to himself as well. But Sofri systematically excuse any comparison with noble examples. He is no Julien Sorel, as Elsa Morante used to call him, nor can his case be compared to that of Dreyfus. To illustrate how this long-term practice of entangled or palimpsest prison writing ties in with Sofri's present writing on the pandemic, it is useful to have a look at his May 2020 column in Il Foglio on Carlo Ginzburg's Occhiacci di Legno, of which the republication by Quod Libet happened to coincide with the COVID-19 outbreak in Codogno. Sofri comments on Ginzburg's chapter entitled Killing a Chinese Mandarin, the Moral Implications of Distance, a chapter which had already been an object of scrutiny in his 2004 essay on optimism, but he links it this time to the moral questions posed by the present pandemic. Both Ginzburg's and Sofri's reflections start from a famous apologue by Diderot regarding the moral question if extreme distance elicits indifference. On optimism, Sofri states that the metaphor of distance is no longer valid as a parameter of proximity. Economics has rendered the world vastly interdependent. Sofri, in his 2004 essay, also draws a parallel with the biblical parable of the Good Samaritan to address the question of the proximity of the distant other. I quote, "In misfortune, one's neighbor found lying on bloody ground, a prisoner stripped and shorn, a lost, emaciated poodle, is unrecognizable and cannot be chosen. He or she has been attacked, wounded, and humiliated. All his distinguishing marks have been obliterated. But once you find yourself there and have seen him or her, your turning away is an omission of help, providing there is something that you could do, and one can always do something. Distances are relative, they can be diminished and discontinuous," end of quote. He therefore concludes that human relationality should always be a guiding principle. In his comment on the new edition of Ginzburg's book, Sofri links the apologue of the Chinese Mandarin to the corona crisis in two relevant ways. One concerning our unaffectedness towards the evidence of the pandemic, first in China and in Italy afterwards, and the second tracing a parallel between old age as an extenuating circumstance for killing the Mandarin, and the condition of elderly people during this pandemic, to which the media attribute a sub-life, that is to say, a condition of nor being completely alive nor dead yet. Sofri, in this case, warns against any type of abstraction of proximity with the other. The essay on optimism has been elaborated into the chapter dell'ottimismo in the 2007 collection Chi è il mio prossimo, in which, according to the author in his final note, the essays follow a logic itinerary that brings them from the question of who is my neighbor to the parable of the prodigal son. But this time the perspective is that of the son himself. At the same time, however, Sofri likens these seemingly meaningful knots to a carefully knitted fabric that suddenly falls off the needle. Maybe this domestic catastrophe could be seen as one of the results of the collapse of those metaphors of distance that upheld morality during the Enlightenment, and could be connected as well with Sofri's recurrent use of the postmodern paradox of the butterfly along this collection. Not just the death of the Mandarin, but a butterfly beating its wings in Beijing can provoke an earthquake on the London Stock Exchange. As has been shown with this example of what we have called palimpsest prison writing, Sofri's remediation of his previous work in reflecting on the COVID-19 outbreak offers a key to interpret his attitude towards the written word in terms of daily use, rather than of some higher intrinsic or unique quality. And consequently, in his own writing practice, he seems to make no distinction between the genres of journalism, non-fiction, and literature. On optimism, he phrases his ambivalence towards his role as an intellectual as follows, I quote, "To keep faith with oneself, as I have done, is a necessity that is both urgent and foolish. Solemnity and a sense of the ridiculous combine. If you cede to the first, you become a political prisoner and an aspiring monument, the waving flag of mobilization, or who knows what other symbolic metamorphosis foreign to your own flesh and blood. If you cede to the second, you will caricature and destroy whatever high things you aspire to and might still aspire to in life." End of quote. In Le Prigioni, Sofri defines himself an apolitical prisoner. His apolitical activism could be linked to his own conception of repentance. For him, to be committed means to engage with the pew, in non-pew, not again, nevermore. Not in the sense of a stage halfway the path towards the utopian stance of the not yet, of imagining what humanity will become, but as an act of re-departure from our knowledge of the humanity that we are not anymore. This kind of inverted progressivism is coupled with Sofri to the parable of the prodigal son, whose return back home, his act of dismissal of not doing it anymore, is not the result of bitterness, but of a renewed engagement with what has been left behind. This process of repentance, which Sofri distinguishes from the process of penitence required from the prisoner by the penitentiary system, is an individual achievement which he views separated from prison as an institution of re-education. With this in mind, he comments on the prison riots in March 2020, can therefore be read backwards in the light of his previous statements on the institution of imprisonment in general and on the conditions of captivity in Italy in particular. The title of a 1992 pamphlet on how to write prison sentences is very eloquent in this context. Il futuro anteriore, future in the past. In the following, I will try how many time I have.
8 minutes.
Okay.
8 minutes.
In the following, I will try to briefly link Sophie's observations on the COVID-19 pandemic to some of the strongholds of Sophie's thought on captivity, which are all grounded in his basic idea that prison is to be considered a disgrace if it is not necessary. In 2005, Sophie contributed to a special issue of journal La Nuova Città on the Italian prisons with a small dictionary of key terms, which can be useful as a guide to classify his statements on the present COVID emergency. Sovraffollamento, overcrowding, is one of them, which he ironically defines as the superlative of a superlative. The entry is closely linked with the keywords suicidi in carcere and tentati suicidi, and the list ironically closes on the entry record, which refers to the triplication in 15 years' time of the number of people subjected to penal measures in Italy. All these issues are already present in two of Sophie's most autobiographical collections of prison writings, his 1980 diary together with his Against Prison notes of 1993, both contained in Le prigioni degli altri, and the title echoes Silvio Pellico's Le mie prigioni, to which Sophie refers as a model of nobility he cannot aspire to, and the collection and a selection of the columns he wrote between 1997 and 1990 for his rubric Piccola Posta on Il Foglio, in which the diminutive of Little Post distinguishes these ignoble stories from the noble genre of prison letters. To start with his appendix entitled De Profundis 1993, which closes Le prigioni degli altri, it is striking how little has changed since then in Italy's penitentiary emergency, and this could be interpreted as a proof of Sophie's right to be pessimistic on prison reforms. He does, however, not exclude himself as a revolutionary idealist in 1968 from having forgotten to look at prisons and to have opened only the asylums. He speaks of the rise of the number of detainees between 1991 and the end of 1992, which peaked from 25,000 to 49,000. On a maximum capacity of 30,000 places. He also remarks that Italy, in comparison to other European countries, has a low imprisonment rate, but that in more than 70% of the cases, the term of imprisonment is lower than 1 year. Furthermore, he speaks of the growing numbers of extracomunitari, which in the Rebibbia prison reached 30% of the total. He also mentions the increase of drug addicts and of jailers affected with AIDS. While having reached the adult conclusion that prison cannot be abolished, Sophie refuses in his notes to accept the idea that prison serves the aim of re-education of the convict. This namely goes against his principle that prison is only acceptable when it serves to prevent the liberty of individuals who committed severe crimes and who threaten to do so also in the future. In all other cases, prison is superfluous and even harmful from the point of view of social security and despicably cruel from a moral point of view. Re-education, according to Sophie, regards only and solely the soul of the prisoners, who are their own educators when they find the force for it, when they already have this force in themselves. This means that Sophie only believes in reforms that solve overcrowding by introducing alternative sanctions, more specifically the so-called Legge Gozzini, a law introduced in 1986, but which met with fierce resistance and was never fully implemented. In his Piccola Posta of 11 March, Sophie mentioned 3 alternative models of resistance in times of the new cholera, to which the one of non-violence which he practiced himself many times, is the biopolitical weapon of hunger strike. He also mentioned who risks to remain invisible and forgotten in this pandemic. Those who participate in the prison riots are young and close to the end of their prison time. But what about the lifers? The issue of life imprisonment, and especially life imprisonment without parole, is another stronghold in Sophie's criticism of Italy's penitentiary administration, which does not grant the prisoner the responsibility of his own re-education. He restated his opinion of prison as an inhumane institution in January 2019 in occasion of Cesare Battisti's extradition to Italy, an argument he used in the past also to defend Priebke's and Gelli's suspension from the sentence of life imprisonment. This non-prison attitude makes him side with the Radicali movement and their hunger strikes, the most recent of which is Rita Bernardini's against hunger and overcrowding during the COVID-19 emergency. And now I come to my conclusion. This radical standpoint does, however, not prevent his continuous commitment to create more humane prison conditions, such as his engagement with the liberalization of the restrictions on sexuality, affectivity in prison. To conclude, in his essay on optimism, Sophie argued that this is essentially a question of pessimism, and he qualified himself as a reform-oriented, pessimistic citizen of that system. His writings against prison, therefore, could be said to correspond to a model of persistence rather than one of resistance. In Le prigioni degli altri, he wrote, "Si esce dal carcere con lo sguardo rivolto all'indietro." This backwards-looking attitude, together with his conviction to always act in function of the prison of the others, maybe allows me to apply one of his most recent columns on the memory of Matteotti to his perspective of himself as the prodigal son. In his Piccola Posta of 2 February, he quotes Giacomo Matteotti, whose motto was "Sono rivoluzionario perché sono riformista." To empty the sea with a bucket also means to continue to exercise the ignoble task of reforming a prison that, ideally speaking, should not even exist. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Monica, for such rich talk. I'm sure will be interesting to listen to the next speaker, because we will see there are something in common from two different points of view. And I'm pleased to introduce immediately the third speaker, Dr. Stefania Basilisco, from the Italian Ministry of Justice. Since 2009, Stefania Basilisco has been an official of the Italian Ministry of Justice, Department of the Penitentiary Administration, where she specializes in prison, re-education, and criminological policies. Her main tasks include the rehabilitation of prisoners while they serve their sentences. She coaches penitentiary staff, collaborates on national and international research groups working on the resocialization of prisoners and their treatment within the prison. Since 2012, she has been collaborating with the University of Florence as a member of the International Research Group on the Treatment, Rehabilitation and Defense of Human Rights of the prison population. She has a master's degree in criminology, psychopathology, and forensic sciences from the LUMSA University of Rome, and she has published articles on the treatment of inmates within the penitentiary with a focus on different categories of offenders. A member in good standing of the Italian Society of Criminology, she participated in the Congress of 2019 with a study on the narratives of the offenders and imprisonment created and disseminated by the penitentiary institution. She is a member of the National Association of Treatment Officers of the Department of Prison Administration of the Ministry of Justice. So, and now the title of our paper is Il carcere e la detenzione in Italia tra sovraffollamento, pandemia, luoghi comuni ed invarianza, l'irrisolta questione della finalità rieducativa della pena. Passo la parola a Stefania Basilisco.
Grazie, ancora una volta buonasera a tutti e grazie ancora per avermi invitato a questo splendido convegno. Spero che vediate le slide, che vediate il mio schermo e che mi sentiate bene. Sì, ok.
Dovresti lanciare la PowerPoint, aprirla. Vediamo il tuo schermo,
ok,
ma non
ci
ancora
sono.
la PowerPoint.
Adesso la vedete?
No, vediamo ancora il tuo schermo.
Io vedo invece la Power. Sei in condivisione e mi dice che sono in condivisione.
Ma controlla, se fai screen sharing dovresti controllare di stare facendo lo sharing sulla parte giusta di schermo.
Sì.
Ah, ok.
Prova a tornare indietro.
Sì.
Vedete adesso?
No. Se chiudi la funzione share screen, forse sì, esatto, quindi adesso quando schiacci su share screen e scegli la funzione giusta, ci sono diverse opzioni, dovresti aprire direttamente
il PowerPoint.
Esatto, sì.
Ok. Lo vedete adesso?
Sì,
perfetto. Ok, grazie, grazie mille per il supporto.
No problema.
Allora, le slide sono in inglese, per cui spero che riusciate a seguirmi bene. Intanto il titolo del mio intervento credo che sia abbastanza esplicito e chiaro. Io vorrei appunto parlare di quella che è la situazione in carcere in questo momento, tra pandemia, luoghi comuni e un profondo sentimento di incapacità di cambiamento. Tutto questo avviene in un dibattito pubblico che diciamo sembra aver completamente dimenticato le possibilità della rieducazione della pena. Ovviamente mi piacerebbe anche parlare della possibilità che esista un interrogativo sulla, diciamo sulla chance di fare un tipo di narrazione differente rispetto al carcere, un tipo di narrazione che si fondi sulla possibilità di realizzare un carcere giusto. E con questo termine mi voglio rifare alla concezione della giustizia di Zagrebeschi, quando dice che la giustizia è un concetto inafferrabile, ineffabile, inattingibile sul piano concettuale, perché essa esige invece l'esperienza. E mi piacerebbe appunto raccontare alcune delle tappe, diciamo, disorientanti che hanno contraddistinto questo anno, per diciamo comprendere se è possibile parlare di alcuni elementi di profonda e disperata resilienza che il carcere invece a me sembra continui suo malgrado a manifestare. Ovviamente il mio punto di vista rappresenta il punto di vista di un practitioner, perché io sono parte di questo sistema. Io sono appunto un funzionario del Ministero di Giustizia, per cui parlo come persona che è appunto parte di questa organizzazione. Ovviamente quando, come diceva poco fa la professoressa Jansen, è esplosa la pandemia del Covid, è stato immediatamente evidente che sarebbe stata un'enorme tragedia e che sarebbe stato molto difficile tentare di gestire la situazione in carcere, proprio perché diciamo il numero esponenzialmente alto di presenze dentro le carceri italiane, comparato con l'esiguità degli spazi a disposizione e con delle strutture edilizie assolutamente inadeguate, hanno reso subito evidente che si trattava di qualcosa che sarebbe stato davvero molto difficile gestire. Il problema è che dal momento in cui è iniziata questo sviluppo della pandemia, le rivolte all'interno delle strutture penitenziarie e i provvedimenti normativi che sono stati intrapresi hanno messo in primo piano quello che è il significato sociale del carcere in questo momento e hanno evidenziato quella che è l'aspettativa generale riguardante l'istituzione penitenziaria. Ovviamente l'osservazione dello stato attuale sembra rendere ridondante e superfluo persino porre la domanda della possibilità rieducativa della pena come funzione prioritaria in realtà della pena stessa, perché appare dilagante una considerazione invece diffusissima di un carcere che abbia connotati solo al negativo. Ciononostante, come avviene in tutti i momenti in cui la crisi è veramente profonda, nello squarcio lacerante si può forse aprire uno spiraglio e ci sono alcune esperienze che probabilmente parlano di questo e se volessimo provare a leggerlo potremmo aprirci verso prospettive di significato differenti che potrebbero addirittura concretizzarsi in realtà differenti. Ovviamente percorrere questa strada equivale ad adottare un cambio di paradigma che consegni definitivamente alla storia il modello di rappresentazione del carcere come istituzione totalitaria e totalizzante di goffmaniana memoria e sviluppi invece una prospettiva di significato maggiormente orientata verso i valori positivi che l'istituzione penitenziaria deve rappresentare. In questo senso un paradigma rivoluzionario dentro il contesto penitenziario può essere quello della comunità educativa per quanto riguarda il carcere e della learning organization per quanto riguarda il sistema penitenziario nel suo complesso. Poco fa la professoressa Jansen ha già ricordato alcuni dei provvedimenti che hanno scatenato un dibattito mediatico infernale. Il primo di questi è stato proprio il decreto legge dell'8 marzo che sostanzialmente ha sospeso i colloqui con i familiari e ogni tipo di visita in carcere, permettendo che i colloqui ovviamente venissero svolti attraverso delle strumentazioni elettroniche. Proprio in questi giorni, cioè subito dopo l'8 marzo, sono iniziate le rivolte dentro le carceri. Il risultato di queste rivolte è stata la morte di 13 persone, insieme chiaramente a uno scenario devastante dentro alcuni istituti e soprattutto durante un dibattito mediatico che ha assunto dei toni davvero enormi. In tutto questo, uno dei passaggi fondamentali per comprendere la qualità del tipo di narrazione che è stata sviluppata, a mio avviso, è stata questa circolare che è stata emanata mentre era capo del Dipartimento il magistrato Basentini. In questa circolare l'autorità penitenziaria, il Dipartimento dell'amministrazione penitenziaria, segnalava ai dirigenti che adottassero dei provvedimenti segnalatori verso l'autorità giudiziaria nei riguardi delle persone che fossero in condizioni di salute particolarmente gravi, appunto perché il rischio di contagio da Covid in un ambiente così complesso e stressato come quello del carcere, con tutte le problematiche che sono state fino ad ora ricordate, rendeva esponenzialmente alto il rischio di morte. La questione è questa, la circolare in realtà diceva qualcosa di molto semplice e che esiste già nella normativa italiana ed è una previsione tutelativa dei diritti umani fondamentali e del diritto della salute. Tuttavia il settimanale L'Espresso accostò immediatamente questa circolare alla possibilità che venissero scarcerati alcuni detenuti mafiosi e quindi si è scatenato un dibattito rovente nella opinione pubblica guidata ovviamente dai mass media che hanno esacerbato i toni sui quotidiani e sui mezzi di informazione, scatenando e fomentando e alimentando un dibattito politico e pubblico dai toni davvero incredibili. Ovviamente solo a valle diciamo, delle dimissioni dell'allora capo del Dipartimento e della sua sostituzione con 2 magistrati antimafia, si è iniziato a tentare di comprendere davvero cosa fosse accaduto e soprattutto a sottolineare il fatto che in particolare quello strumento non era assolutamente uno strumento creato ad hoc durante il momento della pandemia, ma in realtà è una normativa preesistente. Questo argomento mi sembra particolarmente interessante perché diciamo, testimonia quello che è un sentimento punitivista nell'opinione pubblica, che è estremamente diffuso e che sembra effettivamente avallare l'aspettativa che il carcere serva in realtà a compiere una forma di vendetta pubblica, una forma di vendetta legale che si sostituisca a quella privata senza tuttavia perdere l'attributo della crudeltà. Infatti, come sottolineano gli autori di un testo apparso di recente in Italia che si chiama Vendetta pubblica, il carcere in Italia, è necessario sostituire assolutamente questa idea di vendetta legalizzata. Naturalmente una delle domande che mi pongo quando ascolto questo tipo di dibattito mediatico e leggo i titoli dei giornali è quale tipo di impatto questo tipo di narrazione possa avere sul nutrimento del cosiddetto mostro interiore e sull'idea di carcere, di detenuto, di istituzione penitenziaria che si fa il mio vicino di casa. E d'altro canto mi viene anche da pensare che se la nostra cultura, la nostra conoscenza e la nostra visione delle cose si forma sulla base di diverse percezioni che si amalgamano costantemente tra loro, costruendo la cornice dentro la quale noi alla fine agiamo, anche l'atteggiamento e la reazione dell'apparato istituzionale deve essere a sua volta influenzata da queste visioni. Mi sembra che se cercassimo in questo momento di accostarci a una lente teorica per comprendere quello che sta avvenendo dentro l'amministrazione penitenziaria, mi sembra che potremmo proficuamente utilizzare le lenti di Argyris nel modello di learning organization, nell'esplicitare che esistano in realtà dentro l'organizzazione penitenziaria 2 differenti tipi di teorie, appunto le teorie dichiarate e quelle in uso. E come nella teoria di Argyris, ovviamente, esiste una grande differenza tra le une e le altre. La teoria dichiarata dell'amministrazione penitenziaria, in questo caso, è naturalmente quella della finalità costituzionale della pena e quindi della possibilità rieducativa e quindi della possibilità di offrire degli strumenti che possano migliorare la persona durante la carcerazione. La nostra normativa che abbiamo visto prima volutamente accostata alle immagini della devastazione parla di elementi, di valori assolutamente illuminanti e che potrebbero effettivamente ispirare un altro modello di carcere. Tuttavia la teoria in uso sembra essere molto differente rispetto a quella dichiarata, perché nelle scelte istituzionali e nella visione dell'amministrazione penitenziaria sembra invece diffusa la tacita accettazione di una bassissima aspettativa di successo del carcere per la risocializzazione dei soggetti che vi entrano e una bassa aspettativa di efficacia della funzione rieducativa della pena e quindi sostanzialmente una accettazione della teoria del carcere come università del crimine. Se riflettiamo per esempio su 2 aspetti che sono stati già abbondantemente segnalati, come quello per esempio del sovraffollamento e delle condizioni edilizie delle strutture penitenziarie, ci rendiamo conto che queste sono diventate effettivamente delle problematiche sistemiche, strutturali. E nel tentativo di adottare soluzioni possiamo constatare come in diverse occasioni, benché siano stati aperti tavoli di lavoro e di confronto, le soluzioni che pur sembravano essere a portata di mano non sono state poi attuate sotto il profilo operativo. Penso per esempio alla convocazione degli Stati Generali dell'esecuzione penale del ministro Orlando del 2016. quando furono organizzati 18 tavoli tematici per analizzare la condizione della pena e sviluppare una progettualità che andasse nel principio rieducativo della pena stessa. Uno di questi tavoli si chiamava proprio lo spazio della pena, architettura e carcere, e aveva l'obiettivo centrale della riqualificazione degli spazi detentivi. Era il 2016. Qualche settimana fa sul sito del Ministero di Giustizia si evidenziava l'avviamento di una commissione di lavoro finalizzata a una riqualificazione degli spazi della pena. La raccolta di scritti pubblicata subito dopo la conclusione dei lavori della Commissione si apre con questa frase: il carcere è un ozio senza riposo, dove le cose facili sono rese difficili da cose inutili. Quindi io credo che nel sistema penitenziario aleggi in realtà, sebbene in una forma di teoria non dichiarata, una paralizzante sensazione di blocco, un obbligo morale all'immobilismo totalizzante, come se il peso del paradigma di istituzione totale rendesse automatico ogni insuccesso e inutile ogni tentativo di rinnovamento, come se in fondo sia più naturale fallire rispetto agli obiettivi tanto ambiziosi che ci pone la Costituzione e la nostra normativa penitenziaria, date le vincolanti condizioni sistemiche, piuttosto che raggiungere gli scopi prefissati. E quindi mi sembra che la teoria che aleggi sia sempre la stessa. Tuttavia, a me sembra invece che sia vero il contrario, perché se noi esaminiamo la storia e l'organizzazione delle strutture detentive che funzionano, come quella per esempio del carcere di Padova, ci rendiamo conto che tutto può essere fatto dentro il sistema che già esiste, aderendo più possibile alla normativa e declinandola in chiave umanistica, poiché la funzione rieducativa della pena, a differenza della funzione punitiva, è una funzione che deve essere agita da tutto il sistema penitenziario e non è una funzione delegabile ad alcuni ruoli professionali anziché ad altri o ad alcuni programmi di trattamento e non ad altri. È una funzione che deve essere embedded in tutto il sistema penitenziario perché possa davvero realizzarsi. Quando in un unico contesto si trovano delle persone disposte a lavorare in questo modo, io credo che si sviluppino delle possibilità reali. Questo secondo me significa che il modello dell'istituzione totale può essere superato e che esso, come vedremo tra breve, è divenuto addirittura obsoleto. Come scriveva Kuhn, quando un paradigma si rileva inutile ad interpretare costruttivamente la realtà contingente, è necessario che si stabilisca un nuovo paradigma per superare la crisi profonda, a cui porta l'assenza di un costrutto efficace. Nel modello di Kuhn, una delle possibili evoluzioni della fase di crisi è la proliferazione di nuove soluzioni, fino all'emergere di un nuovo paradigma che sia alternativo a quello vecchio. Se noi aspirassimo alla realizzazione di quest'ultima possibilità, potrebbe essere utile valutare quali nuove soluzioni sono disponibili in questo momento tragico che potrebbero eventualmente comporre un nuovo paradigma. Credo infatti che parallelamente al disastro che è stato raccontato e che è avvenuto nelle carceri italiane al tempo del coronavirus, ci siano state alcune esperienze che rivelano una possibilità generativa di cambiamento, esperienze che associerei appunto al costrutto di comunità educativa per quanto riguarda il carcere e che possono, a mio avviso, creare un nuovo paradigma. Esse sono individuate anche in alcuni articoli recenti come forme di esperienze di resilienza che in breve possiamo condensare su 3 elementi fondamentali. E questi 3 elementi fondamentali mi sembrano essere lo sviluppo di un'identità comunitaria all'interno del carcere che è ancorata al sentimento di solidarietà pluridirezionale, la scoperta di una possibile funzione sociale del lavoro penitenziario e una rinnovata sensazione di scopo, l'apertura del carcere alle strumentazioni informatiche e ad internet che apre definitivamente uno squarcio nell'istituzione totale. Questi 3 fattori necessitano di essere percorsi perché sono 3 possibili nuove strade. Il primo punto, che coglie nel carcere la natura di comunità e ne sottolinea il sentimento di solidarietà, consente di rilevare come questo paradigma sia stato sinora troppo poco utilizzato. In realtà, Parlare di solidarietà dentro il carcere in un approccio laico e socio-pedagogico porta a considerare come tale elemento, finora poco valorizzato a livello sistemico e strutturale, potrebbe invece consentire di adottare un cambiamento di prospettiva potenzialmente fruttuoso che supporta il rovesciamento del luogo comune del carcere come università del crimine e di luogo nel quale le relazioni sono necessariamente violente e alienanti. Nella mia esperienza penitenziaria ho riscontrato come esista naturalmente un triplice livello di solidarietà nelle relazioni tra le persone detenute e gli operatori penitenziari e che potenzialmente il terzo livello di questa solidarietà potrebbe arrivare sino alle vittime, cioè sino alle parti offese attraverso i percorsi di riparazione. Pertanto riuscire ad utilizzare professionalmente questo sentimento e a stabilizzarlo in maniera strutturale attraverso interventi fondati potrebbe costituire un terreno su cui costruire ulteriori nuovi percorsi. Queste vie porterebbero inoltre alla costruzione di un ambiente socio-valoriale, alla ricostruzione di un ambiente socio-valoriale di ogni struttura detentiva, riqualificando il sistema relazionale del carcere sotto una lente innovativa ma realistica. La capacità di orientare il lavoro verso un obiettivo esterno, anche di tipo solidaristico, rende possibile la costruzione reale di un ponte tra dentro e fuori e conferisce un rinnovato senso di scopo per la persona detenuta e per gli operatori, che orienta delle scelte che sono più affini ai valori costituzionali. Questo fattore potrebbe avere un'enorme importanza anche sull'aspettativa sociale del carcere, ridefinendo non solo l'obiettivo dell'istituzione nei riguardi della società, ma anche quello della società nei riguardi dell'istituzione e costruendo un rapporto di reciprocità. L'utilizzo della tecnologia rappresenta infine un potenziale enorme cambiamento nell'organizzazione complessiva del trattamento e nel rispetto dei diritti fondamentali delle persone detenute. Per segnalare solo due aspetti che immediatamente trarrebbero beneficio dall'ottimizzazione dell'uso di Internet e della tecnologia, è necessario capire come questo aspetto potrebbe scardinare la rigidità organizzativa tradizionale, dando la possibilità di comunicare in una maniera molto più libera e aperta e soprattutto molto più simile a quella che utilizziamo nella società reale, diciamo così. E questo diminuirebbe la sensazione di estraneazione, contrastando alcuni degli effetti della personalizzazione. Ovviamente, se è vero che tutte quante le crisi portano dentro di loro, diciamo, la possibilità che un paradigma muoia e che se ne sviluppi un altro, credo che quello di comunità educativa potrebbe essere quello più razionale e fruttuoso. Come scrive appunto la neoletta ministra della giustizia, è necessario che il tempo del carcere non sia un tempo di abbandono, ma di forte impegno educativo di tutta la società, perché chi sbaglia può sempre correggersi, sicché, come esigono i principi costituzionali, la pena deve sempre guardare al futuro ed è necessario per queste ragioni diffondere l'interrogativo che poneva il cardinale Martini: cosa ci guadagna e cosa ci perde la società da un sistema del genere? Per tutte quante queste ragioni vorrei davvero ringraziare Elena e Matteo per aver organizzato questo momento di condivisione, perché credo che diffondere una rinnovata percezione del carcere sia fondamentale e che sia necessario coltivare gli spazi per aprirsi a idee e pensieri impensabili e che tutto quanto questo ci aiuta a costruire una nuova immaginazione e una rinnovata possibilità di rappresentazione che forse può portarci verso il cambiamento. Grazie.
Thank you, Stefania, for your inspiring talk that I read as an invitation to look for new narratives and also to look at the penitentiary system with other eyes. And I think we will have an interesting question for all the speakers. So maybe we can immediately open a discussion. So is someone would like to start with the first question? I'll look at you, everyone. I don't see anyone, at least. Not yet. So, okay, maybe we can start with a general question. I was thinking about the three presentation. Let's look at from the side of the reception of the films, how they were received at the time, and also how soul-free can be considered and what its writing are received by Italian public, and of course how Italian society react to the terrible situation in Italian prisons. So let's look from the side of the reception. Maybe each of you can look at this point. Matteo or
I can start if you want. Yeah, well, the matter of reception is interesting. These, if you think of the directors, you know, of the two films that I mentioned, but of course there are many others. There would be Pietro Germi and you know, really a lot of others. These were mainstream directors. I mean, Damiani was an important director, and Pazzaglia himself was a rather strange example of director, because you know, it was mostly into of course comic films, and that he was a member of Quelli della Notte. You know, it was one of the gang of Quelli della Notte, so had this of course incredibly satirical approach to things. But that I don't think many people saw Farfallon talking about Pazzaglia as you know, a strong critique of the prisons, at least at, you know, at first sight. But I think he acted on you know, the collective conscience of the time, in a way that reawakened you know, the set collective conscience on the matter of prisons. I mean, it's especially if you think of the list of pitfalls, of flaws that is you know, listed by that inmate. You know, I believe, even if it's not even if it's kind of concealed below the you know, the satirical shell of the film, at the time it must have come across as incredibly relevant, incredibly poignant for the you know, the public debate, even you know, for those who watch Farfallon purely for entertainment. And well, as far as Damiani's film is concerned, well, that was a punch in the viewer's stomach, you know, in many respects, as was La Piovra. You know, with La Piovra had a powerful way of entering Italian people's houses and you know, facing them with the problem of the mafia, which was basically everywhere. You know, that was the message of La Piovra. You know, from the image, from the, you know, in the public imagery, the image of La Piovra itself became the symbol of mafioso infiltration within society. So clearly, the reception, we must assume had you know, was you know, helped. As I said, it's difficult as usual to determine how much, right? But we can assume that it had a weight in also in the parliamentary debate. You know, because if you look at the numbers of these films that were produced between 1969 and 1975, there was a precise strategy. I mean, it became you know, one of the leitmotif of Italian cinema at the time. And there is another interesting aspect to this. You know, Damiani's film was inspired by a work of literature, a very minor work of literature. At the same time, there's another case which was not a blockbuster, but certainly a highly viewed film at the time, which is Detenuto in attesa di giudizio with Alberto Sordi. Itself based on Operazione Montecristo by Lelio Luttazzi, the case of Lelio Luttazzi, a TV presenter, musician, one of the most famous anchormen in Italian television, in the history of Italian television, who was jailed in attesa di giudizio because he was one of his calls was monitored by the police, and by mistake he ended up in jail, and he stayed in jail for more than a month. And that had made a big impression on public opinion, and revealed somehow the incredibly unjust institution of preventative imprisonment. And of course, that became one of the talking points, the big talking points for in the Italian public opinion of the time. So I believe there's a lot of work to do in assessing how relevant and significant these literary and cinematic works, the significance for the public debate and for the evolution of the parliamentary debate as well, which ended in a half and half reform, because the 1975 reform was important in itself to kind of cancel many aspects of the fascist rules and legislation on the prison. But of course, there was still quite a lot to do, and there's still a lot to do today as well, as we heard from Monica's perspective and Sophie's perspective, of course, and from a practitioner's perspective with Stefania.
Thank you, Matteo. I don't know if Monica or Stefania. Maybe Monica, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, from the question of reception in the case of Sophie, I think it's interesting, but because I have the impression that his books are not really studied, or that he is more associated with the caso Sophie, with his own juridical case. And I didn't find any studies on his writings, or nearly nothing. So I was wondering myself what the reception of these books is. But they are very acute, or they are very profound. I think they are really worthwhile to read. But and as a public figure, of course, he is controversial as well. And in 2015, there were a lot of polemics when he was asked to be part of a governmental commission for prison reform. And so he did not accept this position because of the controversy this caused. And he as a journalist, he's very active, but also on other in other ways. For example, he writes books for children to be read in prison. So he wrote Racconto di Natale, Gli Angeli del Cortile. So he also contributes to socializing in prison. One of the things he really finds also very unacceptable is that prisoners cannot be together with their children, or when they have there are also he describes also cruel episodes of a mother who commits suicide, and her 2-year child is with her alone in the cell. So well, that's also and he contributes to this socialization project, maybe also with these books for children. And another thing, what he did was in 2010. He wrote a poem on the famous poem by Primo Levi, Se questo è un uomo, to contribute to the Rosarno tragedy, the migrant tragedy related to Rosarno, and this poem was read by different actors on and published on Repubblica, and it was read by different actors, Gigi Proietti and Monia Ovaggia. They all read this poem in a kind of caravan to express their solidarity with the victims of Rosarno. So he also engages in other ways that are maybe more more effective to reach a big public, a greater public.
Okay, thank you, Monica.
Yes, I wanted to add one thing. Just, I think this is the point, and I think it's complementary to the question you asked me as well, because Sofri's works became, you know, kind of not really a propaganda weapon for the betterment of inmates' conditions and all that, but they became so when they went beyond the ideological filter, because as you said, Sofri is always seen as you know, part of one specific area of the political spectrum. So as soon as it became, you know, his works were filtered through the you know, the words of an actor, of actors in this case, or performers, they became, you know, heard somehow. So I'm not surprised that, you know, Sofri's works are not that much studied, because of course there's that ideological issue, if you want to call it so. I think, you know, it's, I think that's an evident aspect of the situation.
Right.
Yeah. Whereas with films, for instance, you know, you have that, you know, you escape from the ideological bit, unless it's a really militant film. But you know, films can be militant even if when they aren't deliberately, like, you know, the satirical ones, like the comic ones.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. Stefania, would you like to add something?
Anche in italiano, eh?
Of course.
Grazie mille. Sì, condivido insomma, le cose che avete appena detto. Naturalmente rispetto a quello che io vi ho proposto c'è una differenza fondamentale. Io vi ho voluto portare dentro le carceri italiane, nel senso che vi ho voluto parlare di alcuni meccanismi e di alcune pratiche. Mi interessa però diciamo, provare a capire se è davvero possibile costruire qualcosa di diverso. Quindi credo che insomma, l'elemento per me centrale sia il fatto di aprire in realtà un dibattito interrogativo sul carcere, perché credo che per diciamo, per passare da, diciamo, per percorrere una distanza e per, diciamo, arrivare verso un contesto differente, sia necessario appunto sviluppare diverse tappe. E credo che un modo utile insomma, per abbandonare alcuni stereotipi pesanti sia proprio quello di condividere delle riflessioni e di aprire in questo modo il carcere. Mi sembra che diciamo, sia nella riflessione di Monica che forse anche in alcuni spunti che ha offerto Matteo si possa effettivamente vedere come l'assurdità della chiusura genera veramente un meccanismo vorticoso e che è completamente lontano effettivamente da quello che auspichiamo possa essere il carcere nella sua funzione sociale oltre che giuridica. Per cui insomma, io credo moltissimo nella necessità di aprire dei dibattiti trasversali sul carcere che incrocino degli interessi anche molto differenti e insomma con ragionamenti sui quali a volte è difficile trovare un filo conduttore, ma insomma io penso che tutto quanto questo possa servire in qualche modo a, diciamo, a rinnovare un certo tipo di mentalità e quindi a cambiare la nostra cultura su questo.
Thank you. I don't know if we have still time for some question, one question maybe, yes? So please. We don't hear you, Matteo, sorry.
Alessandro raised a hand, I think.
Oh,
right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Alessandro.
Yeah, thank you, grazie. And thank you for your presentation. Again, really fascinating. I have a question that is for all the three presenters. And one is maybe more specifically the first part for Matteo. And I want to ask you about the Legge Gozzini in this frame that you give it from the 70s and then also coming toward the 90s, but there is also the Legge Gozzini in between, which was a moment in which there was a kind of same debate as Stefania mentioned about this fear of the public about the mafiosi that could leave the prison because it happens with the Legge Gozzini, especially connected to kidnapping. Some kidnappers were in prison and then they were out and they kidnapped during their free time, let's say that. But of course, the Legge Gozzini was also extremely important for whoever were not connected to organized crime, which is, of course, the vast majority of the population in jail. So we are, as a country, always, like, unfortunately, in between this kind of positions, which are both legitimate. But my question, this is for all of you, is about the dialogue between the people that are in prison and whoever is in charge of the reforms. Is there a dialogue between the two? Because, for example, you mentioned about 2016, the Orlando, you mentioned about a lot of tables where the people in prison involved in this kind of debate. How is that possible to create a dialogue? And Monica, why, I didn't understand why when he was invited, Sofri did say no to the parliamentary committee. I'm not familiar with that. So if you can tell more about it, because I think it would be very interesting. And the last point is, how can the people that are not neither in jail or in charge of the reform get involved in possible ideas of change? For example, and then I close, I have a good friend of mine that created a very good project in Verona with animals. So, for example, in short, like the people, like citizens, can bring their dogs when they go on vacation in jail, and the people inside the jail take care of the dogs. And that's the kind of bridge between the external world and the internal world of prison. But the problem is always money. Like, how do you create project? There are funds for this kind of project that comes from the external population. And that's it.
So, Matteo, maybe to start, or Monica.
I think Stefania is probably in a better place to answer this question, because it has to do with public engagement and the dialogue between the world, the outer world, and the world of the penitentiary and the legislator. And it's true, I think, if I just may add this, that in general, the legislator, and this is a massive problem, of course, but without trying to avoid any polemic, the legislator has this attitude to kind of making decisions in general without really canvassing the population, especially when it comes to carceral population. I don't think many legislators asked inmates, what could we do to make your life in prison better? And this is, might be too revolutionary to do and to ask to do, but this would be a step forward. But nobody has ever done that, as far as I know.
Posso provare a rispondere? Allora, volevo partire da quello che Alessandra chiedeva rispetto in particolare agli stati generali dell'esecuzione penale, no? Che io ho citato prima nel paper? Allora, innanzitutto sì, la risposta è sì, cioè nel senso che sono stati aperti diversi gruppi di lavoro e addirittura io posso parlarvi di quello che abbiamo fatto nel carcere dove io lavoro, insomma nel quale io sono responsabile dell'area trattamentale. Abbiamo organizzato un gruppo di lavoro insieme all'Università di Firenze. Abbiamo creato quindi diciamo, un progetto pedagogico condiviso con l'università e abbiamo inviato al tavolo, diciamo, alla commissione del ministro Orlando alcune proposte su diversi tavoli, perché appunto sono stati aperti numerosi 18 tavoli, come dicevo prima, su argomenti molto, molto diversi. Insomma, poi l'iter di quella commissione è stata piuttosto complessa, in realtà ha sortito alcuni effetti per quanto riguarda la giustizia minorile, un po' meno per quanto riguarda quella degli adulti, però un aspetto specifico rilevante è stata che diciamo attraverso degli sviluppi legislativi che non vi saprei neanche diciamo ripercorrere in tutte quante le loro parti, ma un punto cruciale è stato il fatto che il ministro Orlando abbia ottenuto che diciamo attraverso quello che la Commissione ha deciso, sul carcere potessero essere adottati dei decreti legislativi a riforma, come riforma della legge 354 del 75, quindi della legge penitenziaria. Naturalmente questo strumento è stato utilizzato per riformare alcuni aspetti poi diciamo, della normativa penitenziaria. Rispetto a questo tema, la mia domanda è questa, cioè è troppo alta l'aspettativa di cambiamento che noi riponiamo in una cosa come una commissione di lavoro, dei tavoli di studio, oppure è effettivamente estremamente inefficace il risultato? Non credo che sia a me dirlo, però effettivamente il problema si pone. In merito invece all'altra questione che sollevava Alessandra, è sempre una questione molto, diciamo, operativa che mi chiama in causa sotto il profilo proprio specificamente più professionale. Dal mio punto di vista io non credo che il problema della non realizzazione delle attività trattamentali o significative e che creino veramente un ponte tra l'interno e l'esterno sia un problema economico. Non è questo il punto. Il punto è invece è un problema culturale e c'è anche un altro aspetto che è importante. Ci sono un'enorme quantità di progetti innovativi e significativi. Se davvero andassimo a guardare anche l'istituto penitenziario più, tra virgolette, inutile, cioè quello che ha, diciamo, a un livello abbastanza basso di rendimento, insomma, in termini di efficacia complessiva, in realtà può vantare delle esperienze significative, interessanti, dei progetti innovativi. Il punto non è questo, cioè io non credo che si arriverà mai a un cambiamento se continueremo a parlare di singoli progetti, di singole attività, di momenti significativi in qualche realtà, del panettone di Giotto, insomma non è attraverso queste esperienze che si crea una differenza. Io credo che invece la questione delle attività dovrebbe essere una questione davvero inglobata dentro il sistema penitenziario. Non si può continuare ad accontentarsi di un progetto significativo, dovrebbe essere, diciamo, un flusso sistemico che diciamo, crea un meccanismo di vitalità e non una proposta calata dall'alto. Quindi diciamo che mi sento sempre piuttosto fredda rispetto al racconto di singole esperienze, per quanto possano essere significative e rilevanti, perché lo sono quasi sempre. Però il problema secondo me è un altro, è che bisognerebbe spalmarlo in un'ottica completamente differente e tenendo molto presente la relazione dinamica con le comunità locali. Io credo che questa sia una chiave di volta interessante, credo anche che sia l'unica che è possibile percorrere. Spero di avere in parte, diciamo, risposto ai temi che poneva Alessandra.
Sì, sì, grazie mille.
Maybe a last question, if there is one. Otherwise, we are, I think, on time.
Scusate se vado avanti e indietro, appaio, scompaio. Scusa un attimo, ma ho l'allarme antincendio qua, quindi quindi allora se non mi vedete più e soprattutto se non mi vedete domani è perché sono finito malissimo. Però ecco, no, giusto, ogni tanto devo togliere anche l'immagine perché devo staccarlo, altrimenti ecco.
But I think I don't see any other question at the moment. So I'd like to thank the three speakers, Matteo Brera, Monica Jansen, and Stefania Basilisco, for such inspiring papers. And of course, I'd like to thank Elena and Matteo for the organization of this conference. And this is only the first day, so I hand over to Elena to close this first day.
Okay, thank you very much from me and from Matteo for being with us today, and thank you very much for the great conversations that we started. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 10:30 a.m. with the same structure for a morning panel from 10:30 to 12:15, and then 10:30 to noon, and then from 12:45 to 15 with the closing roundtable. But thank you, and I hope to see all of you tomorrow. And thank you to Maria Bonaria, to Stefania, to Monica, and to Matteo, of course. More to come tomorrow with Alessandra, by the way, who's here with us, and Marina Guglielmi, and I hope Francesca Bigliani, Loredana Polezzi, and other people just left, but we have plenty of speakers. And of course, we are now at 2:35, so I think we should close. But thank you, everybody. And Matteo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. See you tomorrow. A domani.
A domani.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.